Mission Impossible is really interesting because it, alongside the Fast and the Furious, is a rare example of a franchise that has gone on for ages and has actually been more liked as it's progressed. Now, me saying that isn't me giving away my rating up front, because more liked doesn't necessarily mean better. It just means that most people don't really care that much about the early installments of these franchises. I found the first Fast and Furious fine, but kind of boring. The next two were actively bad, and the fourth one, as far as I can remember, was okay. But for me, the big moment where I'm like, alright, this is actually an entertaining series, is Fast 5 when they're driving that safe around Rio. And while you could say that now the series is so ridiculous that it's actively bad, it's nonetheless quite impressive that it was able to survive its 4 earliest films being so boring in order to actually reach the point of jumping the shark in the first place. Or, you know, jumping the swinging car on the rope bridge. Okay, it is actually pretty bad. And it's similar with Mission Impossible, right? Pretty much nobody thinks of the first 3 films when the series as a whole is brought up. No, the moment where Mission Impossible as a series became something that people paid attention to was when Tom Cruise was climbing the Burj Khalifa in the 4th one. I mean, isn't that weird? Like, a film trilogy is often quite a standard length for a series. If a franchise sticks around longer than that, people will often say it's overstayed its welcome. But with Mission Impossible, I swear, it cleared the first 3 films before anyone even considered it that exciting. So with that said, there might actually be more value in the first half of this video, where I'm going to be looking at the 3 films that a lot of people probably don't actually remember that well, and determining if they're any good. So the very opening scene is funny because it gets at my overall point that they hadn't yet realized the entertainment value in doing extreme over-the-top set pieces. Literally, the opening is just that they get this guy to confess to something by emotionally blackmailing him, and then it cuts to the title music. At some point in this review, I might have to mention the fact that in reality, covert military intelligence organizations are incredibly evil, and they do things like torturing people and murdering innocent civilians. Like here, they trick this guy into thinking that he's murdered a prostitute. In reality, it's just a female agent pretending to be dead, but based on convincing him that he's done that, they blackmail him into revealing some information. That's already pretty evil, but if we're being honest, in real life, they probably would have just actually murdered a prostitute. Nah, I'm kidding, guys. I know that the CIA assassinated the president, and they drugged soldiers with LSD without getting their consent, and they tortured innocent villagers in Vietnam in order to get them to give up information, and they supported paramilitary death squads in Latin America, and they facilitated the trade of crack cocaine to their own American cities so that they could financially support the drug trade in order to destabilize Central America, and they've detained and tortured people in Guantanamo Bay without ever formally charging them with any crime, plus they've been spying on their own citizens for years with incredibly invasive technology. Yes, I know they did all that stuff in the past, but they never faced any accountability and everyone just ignored it, so I'm going to assume they've learned their lesson and they're the good guys now. Anyway, this review has already gone way off the rails, but the point is that putting aside the morality of everything, this opening scene isn't very exciting, so it's a bit weird that they chose to open the whole film with this. The main plot of the film can be quite neatly divided into 3 big operations, the first of which is that they need to stop this guy from getting a secret list of US agents. The operation itself isn't that exciting. They have this big planning session, but honestly, even having seen the film several times before, I still couldn't tell you what the actual plan was. But it seems to be not that much more complicated than just sneaking into somewhere wearing disguises and then using computer hacking to bypass all of the security. Hacking was kind of a problem in films from around this time, in that it was basically used to just solve all of the problems with security without the writers actually having to come up with a clever solution. There's no satisfaction in having all of these complicated, intricate security systems explained to you in detail, and then just having them all be instantly bypassed by some guy tapping away at a keyboard for a few seconds. Also, like all media from this time period, everything they do with computers just looks incredibly goofy visually. That's to be expected. Now, what makes this a little bit more interesting than it otherwise would be is that Ethan Hunt's entire squad gets killed. and that makes things feel a lot more real when you have all of these characters just get wasted like they're nothing. You're like, oh wow, this is serious. Obviously, because this happens very early on, we aren't attached to any of these characters, so there's no real sadness, but nonetheless, the assumption could have been made at the start that these characters would be the main ones we would follow throughout the entire film. So the fact they're all killed is, if nothing else, quite surprising as a development. Except, well, it turns out actually half of them survived. One of them was supposed to be killed by a car bomb but got out of the car at the last minute, and the other one was supposedly shot and then fell into a river but actually was able to swim away and survive, and then of course obviously Ethan survives. What makes this really funny is that apparently this entire mission was just a ruse to try and root out a traitor who is on the inside of the organization, and based on the fact that Ethan is the only one who survives, they assume it must be him. So first of all, it never occurs to them that a traitor might want to do something like, oh I don't know, fake his own death if he thinks he's been discovered. But also of course, it turns out a lot of them survive, so you'd think after he finds out so many of them have survived, he would just call up the organization and be like, hey guys, I hate to break it to you, but turns out I am far from the only person to have survived this, so even that incredibly tenuous, flimsy piece of evidence you were using as your entire basis for assuming that I'm a traitor, even that doesn't hold up. After this, there's another moment involving computers where I again genuinely have no idea what happened. There is this quite clever bit that's central to it, where someone mentions that the traitor had a special mission codenamed Job 314, but it turns out actually that is a Bible reference to Job 3:14. That in isolation is quite a clever twist. But for some reason, based on this information alone, Ethan decides to go onto this Bible website where he's somehow able to contact via email the initial buyer for the secret list of special agents. Again, I just can't stress enough how little sense this makes or how little explanation we're given of why he does this. He just goes onto a random website, types in some seemingly pretty random stuff, and somehow this enables him to get in contact with the initial person who hired the traitor. So then there's another funny scene where he's taken to see the buyer, but he's not allowed to see her, so he has a bag over his head. They're like, hey, nobody's allowed to see the boss, so you're gonna keep that bag on your head and you better watch what you say or else we're gonna kill you.
If Max doesn't like what you have to say, you'll be wearing that shroud indefinitely. I'm willing to take the chance.
But Ethan's just like, yeah, okay, but I don't like talking through a fabric bag. And then they just remove it. They're like, oh, okay, whatever you say. Sorry, I didn't realize it was an inconvenience. It's like that one joke from The Simpsons.
Listen, baby, I always get what I want.
I said no.
Oh, did you? Oh, I completely misunderstood. Please accept our apologies.
Genuinely hilarious to me. So anyway, now that he's able to see this super secret criminal boss because he asked to, he makes his case. He says that the disc she's been given is a fake and he'll be able to get her the real disc. Now, in some sense, it seems a bit dumb that his plan is to clear his name as a traitor to the US government by stealing something incredibly valuable from the US government. But his logic is that he can steal it, then stop her from actually using it, and because he's now done the job that was supposed to be being done by the actual traitor, that will bring that person out of the woodwork, and he'll be able to discover who he is and clear his name. I guess that makes sense. Side note, by the way, I wasn't sure where else to mention this, but obviously I watched this again for this review. However, like I say, I'd seen it several times before, and going into it, I wasn't able to remember basically any of the plot. Of course, I do remember the heist that they do at Langley because that is the most iconic moment of the whole film. It is the one exception if you wanted to argue against my claim that the later films are more famous than the earlier ones. Like yes, him climbing the Burj Khalifa is a really famous scene, but if you were to ask a lot of people to remember just one moment that they associate with Mission Impossible, there's a strong possibility the one that they would choose would be him trying to keep his body off the floor as he's hanging in that security vault. The heist is actually pretty stupid though, all things considered. In fact, I'm not even sure where to start, so I guess I'll just go back to the beginning. I actually do like the fact that he decides to search in the database for other disavowed agents. It kind of makes sense. He is assumed to be a rogue, so in order to clear his own name, he now has to collaborate with some other rogue agents. It is a bit of a risk though, considering that you'd think some of them might have been disavowed for good reasons, and also he has to sell them them on involving themselves in this incredibly risky mission. So he's like, hey, you're going to be paid a lot of money because we're going to sell this thing to the buyer. But we know that actually his whole plan is to not sell that thing to the buyer because he doesn't actually want that intelligence to get out. So later on, when he actually gets one of them to help him specifically with not allowing Max to be able to have access to this information, why aren't they like, hold on a minute, your plan is to not actually give this information to the buyer who is going to be giving us the money that you promised us as payment for helping you? Another complaint, we get this really elaborate explanation of all the different security features that this CIA base has. We see someone actually going through all of the security so we can understand in detail exactly what they're going to have to get through. And then they just don't engage with any of those security measures at all. Instead, they just walk in disguised as firemen because a fire alarm goes off, and then they sneak into the vents, which all seems way too easy. And arguably, the most elaborate part of their plan is that for some reason, they know exactly who the one guy is who's likely to be walking in and out of the vault while they're trying to do the heist. So the plan is to keep him out of the room, with Claire, the other survivor from the initial heist, disguising herself as a CIA agent and standing next to him in order to squirt some nauseating chemicals into his tea or coffee, as such causing him to constantly throw up, such that he has to keep running back to the bathroom, not spending very much time in the vault. It just seems like the fact she's able to disguise herself as a CIA agent and walk into the CIA to drug another agent, it's all way too easy, especially considering that they make a point of stressing the impossibility of this heist.
Why don't we drop by, Fort Knox? I can fly a helicopter right in through the lobby and set it down inside the vault. And it would be a hell of a lot easier than breaking into the goddamn CIA.
Honestly, it seems like the hardest part of it, being allowed to just walk into the CIA, is so easy that they come up with two separate, equally easy methods of doing it. Anyway, so circling back to the iconic moment, that in itself is pretty dumb, because the reason why he has to try and keep himself from touching the floor is that there's a guy whose entire job in the heist is just to hold him up by supporting the rope that he's hanging from. Now, I have to say, considering all of the gear that they brought with them for this heist, why didn't they just get something that's capable of holding the rope in its place? Because that's all this guy needs to do. He just needs to hold the rope steady. And then a mouse shows up, which is some real cartoon logic that this guy gets so distracted by a mouse showing up that he almost drops Ethan and screws the entire mission. And then the final stupid thing about this scene is that the sound of the rope rubbing against the metal is almost enough to trigger the sound sensitive alarm, but a knife falling like 6 foot and landing on the desk isn't somehow. In fact, none of the security measures that they actually engage with make any sense. Like, there's this laser mesh that's supposed to guard the entrance from the vent, and the way that they deal with that is just blocking it. Surely blocking it, as in getting in the way of the lasers, would be the thing that triggers the alarm in the first place. Also, there's supposed to be this heat-sensitive alarm that goes off based on the heat signature of an unauthorized person being in the room, and it just doesn't go off. Like, it doesn't do the one thing it's supposed to do. It's not like they come up with some way of doing it, even a stupid nonsense way of dealing with it like they have for some of these other issues. No, they just ignore it, and for some reason it doesn't come into play. Indeed, you'd think, if anything, he's putting off more heat than a typical person would, based on all of the physically extraneous activity he's doing, and we actually see him literally working up a sweat. So yeah, it's an iconic scene, but none of this makes sense. I always compare Heist to Ocean's 11 because that is obviously the iconic heist movie. It had the advantage of the fact the heist takes up the entire film, so they're able to really dedicate themselves to making it great. But even with that said, there is a basic standard, and this falls way short. There is nothing clever about the way that they deal with any of the obstacles. In fact, it seems like the main thing on their side here is bad writing. So obviously Ethan's done all of this with the hope of finding out who the actual traitor is. But it should be said that if you are a remotely attentive viewer, this shouldn't be something you're wondering. It's obvious. See, in the initial operation, there are two hackers, Jim Phelps and the guy who gets crushed by the elevator. So when the guy who gets crushed is like, hey guys, I've lost control of the elevator. It's not responding to any of the inputs I'm putting. Uh-oh, something's gone wrong. It's impossible not to look at Jim and think, well, maybe the only other guy we've seen who's involved in hacking might just be the one who killed that other hacker. Makes sense. He also doesn't look that sad when the other guy dies, but you could say, well, okay, maybe that's just because he's a veteran, so he's used to his colleagues being killed. But then, of course, the other thing that's incredibly suspicious is that when we see Jim die, it looks like the fakest thing ever. See, everyone has these cameras that allow them to see what other people in the team are seeing, although I guess none of them used it when Jim was hacking that computer in order to kill the other guy. However, Ethan does use it when Jim looks at his hands to show that they're covered in blood, which means he must have been shot, and then he just like willfully tumbles over the barrier on the bridge into the river. The whole thing is just so obviously staged to make it seem to Ethan like he's died, when clearly he's not actually taken any damage and he's just going to be able to swim away. It's so obvious he's the traitor considering we are told that there is a traitor pretty early on. The only reason I can imagine it wouldn't have been obvious for people at the time is that Jim Phelps is actually a character from the original TV show that this is based on. The actor who originally played him was supposed to return for this role, but he refused because he really didn't like the idea of Jim's character being written to be a traitor. So maybe that idea was so controversial that nobody even considered it, and as such they thought they could get away with making it super obvious while it would still function as a twist. For me though, as somebody who's never seen the original show, this wasn't controversial and it certainly wasn't a twist. The way that Ethan actually realizes that Jim is the traitor is that, well, firstly, obviously he knows that the traitor has been identifying himself based on a Bible reference. And then he realizes that the Gideon Bible that he's been associating with the traitor thus far was actually taken from a hotel that it was previously mentioned Jim Phelps had attended. This is kind of a good revelation, but the one thing I'm not at all clear on is why is it that Ethan was associating this particular Bible with the traitor, considering he just found it in Jim's room. Yes, this suggests that Jim took a Bible from a hotel he was staying at, but why would this imply that he's the traitor? I should also mention, by the way, he finds out Jim is alive, which that makes it really obvious he's the traitor, because why else would he fake his death? So I guess Ethan has enough evidence to start taking it for granted that Phelps is the traitor, fair enough. What I absolutely don't get is that he just randomly decides that also one of his accomplices for the Langley heist, the guy who was holding the rope, must be in on the treachery as well. I mean, Ethan contacted these disavowed agents somewhat randomly, right? So what are the odds that one of the guys he contacts would happen to be the exact same guy who was an accomplice in the murder of his squad the other night? It's also kind of stupid because, like, okay, so Ethan has an argument with this French guy, that's the accomplice. He's played by that really famous actor who was in a lot of films from around this era, and he basically dunks on him in a quite clever way. What he does is he tricks the French guy into thinking that the intel has been switched by doing some sleight of hand magic tricks.
What's the matter? You've never seen this trick?
And the guy's like, oi, try some of that sleight of hand stuff with my money and I'll kill you. And I don't know, to me, the guy is way more interesting as an overall good person who just has a bit of a personal issue with Ethan, instead of him having to be an actual murderer. It just takes away some of the nuance that, well, obviously, because this guy was kind of antagonistic towards him, therefore he has to be a villain. Anyway, so Ethan Hunt has put all the pieces together and now he's ready to spring his trap. It's kind of stupid the way things are resolved. Basically, he gets Phelps to admit to being the traitor, and it turns out actually he has one of those pairs of glasses that they were using at the start of the film to see what each other are doing, so he now has evidence that Jim is the traitor. I mean, it's fine, but it just seems kind of obvious, like in a universe where people are constantly, as spies, using various gadgets to see and record what other people are doing, to have that be the ultimate downfall of the villain for the entire film just seems a little cheap. Also, it's kind of a little bit pointless that Ethan works all of this out for himself and then Jim just reveals it to him anyway. Goodness me, I forgot how terrible the CGI was for this final action scene. It's so bad, just behold it. Take it in. appreciate it in all its glory. And as if the CGI didn't make this unbelievable enough, they then decide to make it even more ridiculous by having a helicopter get tied up to a train and have to follow it into a tunnel. It's just so stupid. I don't know if this is actually possible. I don't care, honestly, because I refuse to believe it. The only good moment is when the helicopter blade almost cuts Ethan's head off. Like, that actually provided a sense of excitement. But for me, this is definitely one of those moments where overall what is happening is so ridiculous that it just gets boring. For some reason, I have a memory of someone fighting on top of a train in this film, and then like a sign hits one of them and kills them, but I guess that must be another movie because it doesn't happen here. What happens here is actually way more ridiculous. See, Ethan blows up the helicopter that he is currently hanging onto, and then the explosion that destroys the helicopter propels him onto the train, which he's then able to grab and hang onto and survive. It's ridiculous. Now, let's talk about the one thing that everyone wants applied to contemporary film discourse about older movies. Is this woke enough? In all seriousness, I do have a genuine problem with the character of Claire in this movie. Basically, she's treated like a child, which isn't that shocking, I guess, since she's supposed to be the wife of Jim Phelps, even though she looks like she's no older than 30 and he looks like he's at least 60. So that uncomfortable age gap aside, the main reason why I'd say she's treated like a child is that she has no moral agency. Because it turns out she was in on the betrayal and was colluding with Phelps, and in fact it's implied that she actually detonated the car bomb that killed one of the other agents, even though Ethan initially dismisses that notion, but that's only because he assumes she isn't in on it. So now that he knows she is in on it, I guess that means she probably did do that. There's this sort of clever but also sort of dumb scene, I mean I guess that's the entire movie, where Ethan tricks Claire into confessing by putting on a mask that makes him look like Jim. They're really into those masks in these films, and while I did find it to be a surprising reveal and I got some excitement out of that, it did occur to me that this is an incredibly easy way to manufacture a twist at any point by just having it revealed that some character is actually just another character in disguise. But the really confusing thing is that Jim is just in the other room during all this, so I feel like he could have just walked in and been like, hey, stop pretending to be me, thanks. But my real issue is that despite Claire being Jim's accomplice, she's sort of just treated as completely passive, as if she didn't make any decisions herself and was just going along with whatever Jim wanted. Indeed, she never makes any meaningful choices, nor is in any way actually characterized throughout this whole film. In the end, she sort of switches allegiances, but that's not really because of an active choice on her part. Instead, Jim just goes to shoot her for some reason, it's not really clear, I guess just so that she has an excuse to switch over to Ethan's side. But neither Jim nor Ethan nor Claire act as if she has any sort of motivations of her own. The film has this weird vibe of like, well, she was with Jim, so obviously she's just going to go along with everything that he wants like a dutiful wife, but then Jim rejects her, so obviously she immediately switches her allegiances to Ethan because, well, she's a woman, right? She's just going to gravitate towards the nearest man so that he can make all the decisions for her, because that's in their nature. Don't worry what she's actually thinking or what her reasoning was for the actions she made. No, if you looked in her brain, it would just be pink fluffy unicorns and estrogen. It's the soft bigotry of low expectations. I mean, in some sense, it's good for her that she faces zero repercussions for betraying this super secretive government agency. But the fact that she isn't in any way held accountable implies that in the film's logic, she's like beneath accountability, you know, she's just a gal, tee-hee. And of course, standard disclaimer that even if you don't care about the gender politics of all this, it's nonetheless, in terms of quality filmmaking, incredibly bad character writing to have somebody who's quite a major part of this film that has no discernible motivations whatsoever, just a complete blank slate. She's also, obviously, really hot, which makes me think I guess she was just put in this film for her looks. Like when Ethan suspects her of being a double agent, he fights her, but in a sexy way. Like Like, he pins her down, and he gets really close to her, and then he, like, searches her to see if she's got a weapon and is, like, touching all over her body. He didn't do that to Jim when he found out Jim betrayed him. It's like, okay, yeah, I get it. There's an attractive woman, but that doesn't mean that the main character has to constantly be on the verge of having sex with her. Also, fun fact, Jim cucks himself. Like, his entire plan here was that Claire would seduce Ethan in order to get on his side, I guess just so that she can pass on information to Jim. I don't think this whole woman thing is an enduring issue for the rest of these films. I can't remember. I'm gonna keep an eye out for it because these films are admittedly very male. Again, just to reiterate, I am mostly concerned with the overall quality of the films rather than whether they pass the Bechdel test, but in this case, the terrible writing for this female character meant that the overall quality of the film was slightly worse. As for my overall opinion of the film, well, I feel like every single time I watch it, I find myself constantly coming back to considering it a 5 out of 10. I have moments of thinking it's really stupid, and I have other moments of thinking, hey, actually this is pretty fun. Obviously it's an iconic movie, in that it started this really famous franchise, but there's nothing that's fantastic about it by any means. None of the major plot points are really well written. In fact, a lot of the writing is incredibly stupid and disappointing. Still, it's better than average and worth a watch, so I'm comfortable giving it a high 5. Right, this is the latest I've been recording for a while, so I apologize if it just gets darker as I talk. So for those who don't know, Mission Impossible 2 is generally considered to be the worst film. Now, spoiler alert, but I'd probably agree with that assessment. Yes, I know, I'm a sheep. But the thing is, it's not that bad. My broad contention is that the earlier films are mostly just fine. They're forgettable. But there are some things I like here. For one thing, this film has the best variation on the title music. It's the version that's recorded by Limp Bizkit. And then Limp Bizkit turned that entire riff into the introduction to a song that gets me hyped every single time I listen to it. I'm obviously not going to play the whole thing now because copyright, but check it out. Search for Limp Bizkit, take a look around, and see if you can endure that introduction without grooving out. I think this is all partially helped by the fact that in general our introduction to Ethan Hunt is way cooler here. Remember how for the last film I roasted it at the beginning for having a very unimpressive intro? Well, here we see Ethan Hunt climbing this cliff face, which gives me sweaty palms every time I watch it. It's probably my favourite opening scene for any of these films, certainly in that it's the only one that I've actively sought out to watch many times because I just enjoy the exhilaration of watching him conquer these heights. And Tom Cruise is pretty short, so heights must be even more intimidating for him. Anyway, so he gets to the top and then he is on the receiving end of the coolest sunglasses delivery ever, and when he puts them on, he receives a secret message setting up the plot for this film. And as he's informed the message will self-destruct, he takes off the sunglasses, throws them at the camera, and they explode into the opening title sequence. There's no way that looked good. Like, come on, this is how you open a movie. This is how you get people hyped. This film also brings back Luther, played by Ving Rhames, and that's nice. I enjoy some familiarity. Aside from that, though, we get this Australian guy who really doesn't leave much of an impression at all. Most of this film is set in Australia, by the way, which, I don't know, to me, Australia is like the most boring continent. When I hear Australia, I don't think exciting spy thriller. Maybe it's because I'm a fan of strategy games and world history, areas where Australia genuinely is incredibly uninteresting. If I was more interested in dangerous animals, for example, maybe I'd find Australia much more exciting. The villain is decently compelling. Everyone says it makes sense for villains to have upper-class British accents, but I honestly have never understood that at all. Like, what's he gonna do? Have his butler politely ask me to leave? Well, they compensate for any lack of scariness factor by having him partially cut someone's fingers off with one of those, like, things people use to cut the ends off their cigars. I don't know why they do that, I've never smoked a cigar. But yeah, having a villain murder or at least maim someone for a minor infraction is a good way to establish them as evil, and coming up with a creative way for them to do that is always a plus. So yeah, in theory, these are all positive things. Good opening, good music, good cast of characters. What else could you want? well, I guess a plot. I should probably talk about the plot. You might think this is where it all falls apart, but in some sense the plot here is actually better than it was for the first film. See, for the first film, you may have noticed I spent a good amount of time making fun of it and pointing out all the stupid things that happen. But here, annoyingly, I can't just go through the plot and point out all the stupid things. I say that's annoying because it's much easier to just go through a film chronologically and make fun of it. Now I actually have to organize my points for this review, because there's a lot going on all at once, so I probably need to talk about most of my issues holistically. Starting with my prevailing feeling throughout this film, which was one of, wait, what? There were so many moments where I thought I knew what was going on, and then the film would just do something crazy to confuse me. So it starts off, they're talking about Bellerophon and Chimera. If you don't know your Greek mythology, then Chimera was this mythical monster, and Bellerophon was the hero who slew it. I at least knew that much. So since we know that in this film Chimera is being used as a code name for a disease, we can infer that Bellerophon is the cure for that disease. So the plot of this film is about germ warfare. Now it starts off with this guy who's been instructed to transfer the disease from Australia to Atlanta, and he's given a very strict time limit of 20 hours in which to do this. It's also implied that the scientist, Nurkovic, has some reservations about what he's doing. So okay, he sits down and oh look, Ethan Hunt's next to him. I was assuming this is how we're going to be introduced to Ethan Hunt in this film. We're just going to see him undercover as someone who's going to stop this scientist from transporting the disease. Nurkovic is talking to him as if he knows him and he's calling him Dimitri, and I'm like, okay, yeah, this makes sense. This is Ethan Hunt's cover story. Alright. By the way, through this conversation, it's pretty obvious that this guy is transporting the virus by having injected it into himself, which makes sense because it probably wouldn't go past airport security otherwise. That's why he has this very strict time limit where he has to get to his destination within 20 hours before the virus starts showing symptoms, at which point it can no longer be cured. Meanwhile, the plane starts filling up with gas and everyone falls asleep, whereupon Ethan is like, hey, you should really stop calling me Dimitri, by the way, and then he kills the scientist. So I'm like, okay, that's pretty hardcore just killing this guy, especially since we saw that he seemed to have some reservations about what he was doing morally, but alright, sure, you do your thing, Ethan, go off, I guess. And then, wait, what? Turns out that whole time, Ethan was actually somebody else wearing a mask and using a special thing on his throat that allows him to imitate Ethan's voice. The one limitation of these masks in the past was that your voice would give them away, but now, thanks to this totally believable science, there is a sticker that you can just put on your neck and suddenly you can sound like whoever you want. But alright, okay, so that whole time that wasn't Ethan Hunt, and in fact these guys are clearly baddies because they just abandon the plane and leave it to crash with all of those innocent passengers inside. Now eventually we actually return to the real Ethan and we find out through a meeting he has with Anthony Hopkins that he did have a relationship with this Nurkovic guy where he was known as Dimitri. And then okay, this is where it gets weird because Hopkins is like, well, I needed to intercept this guy, so I had somebody else show up looking like you so that he would think you have come to meet him. So that's dodgy because it implies that this operation that murdered hundreds of people was actually an IMF sanctioned operation. Hopkins is like, yeah, I sent Ambrose the bad guy disguised as you because you weren't available, so wait, what? Does this mean that the villain is sanctioned by the good guys? But then Ethan's mission is to take down Ambrose, so I'm confused, did Ambrose betray them? I guess Ambrose was sent on this mission, but he was a double agent, disguised as Ethan, who was also working as a double agent. Meeting up with a guy who, like I say, seemed to have reservations about what he was doing, so I guess he was kind of a double agent too. And I'm not sure to whom Nurkovic was transporting the virus, because I assumed, well, obviously he must be transporting this deadly virus to the bad guys. But then, it was the bad guys who intercepted him and stopped him getting to his destination, so I guess maybe he was bringing the virus to the good guys? The good guys wanted an evil virus that could kill millions of people? This all happens in what I guess is like the first 15 minutes of the movie. Already, we've got everyone betraying everyone else, disguised as other people under fake names. We get a brief respite from all this, during which time we are introduced to the CEO called McCloy, who's interested in buying the Chimera virus. He's in his car when suddenly suddenly his driver stops responding to him and he can't open any of the car doors, and then the car starts filling up with gas. So admittedly this was an assumption from me, but I was like, okay, I guess this is the bad guys killing him because they didn't like an offer he made or something, especially since we just saw at the start of the film the bad guys killing people with gas. I shouldn't assume anything in this movie because of course I was wrong. See, Nurkovich walks in, who we thought was dead, and he informs McCloy that he's been infected with the Chimera virus. And it seems like Nurkovich wants revenge on McCloy because there was this other guy called Dr. Gratz who was also infected. And it turns out that McCloy intentionally infected Gratz because he wanted to see how the virus would work. Now, I'm all for being an evil person who does human experimentation, but you'd think considering this guy profits off of the work of scientists, he wouldn't want to sacrifice a scientist on one of these experiments he's doing. He'd just use some random person as his guinea pig. Anyway, so guess what? Obviously Nurkovich is still dead, and this was in fact Ethan Hunt wearing a mask because he wanted to get some info from McCloy. Although I'm not sure what useful information they were trying to get, because the only thing they seem to get is a confession of murder from McCloy, but that doesn't seem to be of any relevance to them because then they just let him go anyway. I mentioned in my review of the first film I was worried that these super convincing disguises could function as a way to basically really cheaply create a twist out of nothing. At any point, two people could be talking about anything and suddenly, oh wow, what a twist, turns out one of them was a different person all along. See, this whole scene of Ethan Hunt pretending to be Nurkovich occurs right in the middle of a separate scene where Ethan Hunt is talking to a double agent that is working for Ambrose. And I was a bit confused, like, okay, I guess that was like a flashback or something? Why did we just get a completely separate scene right in the middle of Ethan talking to this other person? Well, can you guess what the explanation is? Are you straining your brain at full capacity? Yep, you guessed it. Actually, that wasn't Ethan at all. It was one of the bad guys wearing an Ethan mask to bait her into admitting she's a double agent. Probably the most egregiously nonsensical use of one of these disguises is towards the end of the film when Ethan is fighting with this guy, and it's a quite intense fight that's throwing up a lot of dust, a lot of rubble, no one's really sure what's happening. They end up detonating a grenade and it seems like one of them was blown up or something, it's not really clear. But then a voice comes over the radio and it's Ambrose's henchman saying, hey, I've captured Ethan. Now in my head I thought, hey, maybe that's Ethan using one of those voice modulating things so that he can make himself sound like the henchman. But I thought, well, no, there's no way that would make any sense, because why would he have one of these things to allow him to imitate the voice of this random henchman? Why would he have brought that with him? So he brings in Ethan tied up, and Ethan appears to wordlessly plead with Ambrose, even as Ambrose shoots him in the leg and tortures him. Why isn't he saying anything? Well, the henchman's like, I guess I broke his jaw, haha. Yes, you guessed it. Somehow, this is the henchman who's had his jaw broken and then had a perfectly accurate Ethan disguise forced upon him. And meanwhile, Ethan somehow not only has a voice modulator that allows him to perfectly imitate this guy's voice, but he also had a mask that allows him to look like him too. This is just totally ridiculous, complete nonsense. Insane. The fact that it's possible to perfectly copy someone's appearances with no resources in the middle of a fight scene is absurd. It means that not only can we assume that anyone can be anyone else at basically any point, but that there aren't even any limitations in terms of how difficult it is or what resources you need available to you in order to create one of these masks. You seem to be able to do it just on the fly. And it's not even like this world-breaking mechanic is worth it because it leads to some fantastic reveal. Firstly, because there's no way anyone watching this actually thinks that this is Ethan Hunt being shot dead here. But moreover, it's impossible for a twist like this to be satisfying when anyone could see this twist coming from a million miles away. Anyone except Ambrose, apparently. I hope you can see what I mean when I say my prevailing feeling during this film was just, wait, what? There are so many twists upon twists compounding on each other to the point that nothing that's happening ever makes any sense. And this is why I found it so shocking when Ethan, he goes to destroy Chimera and for some reason he stops. The scene's pretty stupid because Ambrose actually anticipates that Ethan is going to want to destroy destroy Chimera, and he's working out exactly how Ethan would do it such that he would be able to counter him. But the only reason he's able to get there in time to stop Ethan from destroying all the viruses is that Ethan, in the middle of destroying them, pauses for a few minutes to just remember the fact that Nurkovic injected himself with the virus. If he hadn't randomly paused to just think about that, then he would have had time to destroy the entire virus, and he could have ended the whole story prematurely. Now, you might be thinking, well, why did Ethan pause? And believe it or not, the reason is he wasn't just thinking about the fact that's something that Nurkovic did. No, this is actually the first time that he's realizing that's what happened. And what's more shocking is that Ambrose, who was the one who was with Nurkovic in disguise as Ethan on the plane, didn't realize this is what happened.
You never figured out where Chimera really was.
I knew where it was.
Oh. And you knew the only way Nurkovic could smuggle the live virus was by injecting himself and using his own bloodstream as a petri dish. You knew that. While you were knocking him off, destroying the very thing you came for.
This moment was the biggest wait, what moment for me. Because look, I won't pretend otherwise. The fact is, you can probably tell, sometimes I struggle to follow the plot. I mean, this whole time I've been confused about who's betraying who disguised as each other. It's hard to keep up with. And you know, as I was editing my review of the previous film, I realized that there were a few things I missed when I was writing the script, even though I've seen the film like at least 3 times before. I didn't realize that the reason Ethan concluded that the French guy was the accomplice is that he saw the knife and it was the same knife that the French guy had when they were doing the heist. I said it was a massive coincidence that at random the French guy happened to be the person who betrayed them and was also involved in the heist, but Claire actually said that it was her call to bring the French guy along, and we find out that Claire and the French guy were working together, so no, it wasn't a random coincidence. And most egregiously, I didn't actually realise that at the end, Claire quite obviously dies from being shot by Jim Phelps. I mean, I was still kind of right in that the film is written as if she doesn't have any moral agency, because her death is treated more like a tragedy than it is a justified repercussion for her actions. But nonetheless, I genuinely miss the fact that she clearly closes her eyes, gives up the ghost, dies from that gunshot wound, even though it happens right in the center of the frame. So I'm an idiot. You shouldn't listen to anything I have to say about films. I clearly don't know what I'm talking about. But even I was able to work out that based on this virus having a 20-hour incubation period, and this guy being really particular about definitely getting to his destination within 20 hours, he was obviously transferring the virus within his body. And it was also really obvious to me that when Ambrose sends the double agent Naya to go retrieve the last sample of the virus, she injects it into her body so that he won't be able to kill her without killing the virus as well. So I don't know, either my brain is just wired differently, or this is a film where loads of really confusing stuff happens and it's impossible to follow what's going on, but when the most obvious, predictable thing in the world happens, it's suddenly treated like completely new information for all of the major characters. Anyway, let's talk about Naya. Yes, I'm going to be talking about the writing for a female character as if my concern is mostly political, when really I just consider it to be a pretty great litmus test for detecting bad writing. Alright, so at first you might think that this film is going to be even worse in terms of its presentation of female characters.
She's got no training for this kind of thing.
But to go to bed with a man and lie to him, she's a woman. She's got all the training she needs.
And certainly this film has much more of a James Bond vibe to it. When he and his sexy partner go to that horse race, it really might as well be Pierce Brosnan or Roger Moore. And obviously there's plenty of sexual innuendo.
What are you gonna do? Spank me?
Or I guess that's more overt than innuendo. Speaking of being more overt than innuendo, they actually end up just having sex with each other pretty early on in this film. But all of this is fine, except for in that it makes me think I might as well be watching James Bond. But the idea of a sexually empowered woman eagerly hooking up with a decently good-looking guy doesn't bother me at all. The problem with the previous film is that all of the sexual stuff had this weird, aggressive, unwanted energy to it, as if Claire was just inviting all of this sexual tension simply by daring to be good looking. Here, when they first meet, they have to hide really close to each other, and there's this really cute, playful energy to how they're interacting. And she's certainly capable of handling herself. When they first meet each other, it's at this flirtatious Spanish ball where she is sneaking around the house and timing her footsteps to be in sync with the flamenco dancers. It shows that she's thought this heist through and how she's going to move around this house without anyone detecting her. Like, she's intelligent, she has a brain. Sorry to dunk on Claire so much, but there's a really big contrast here that speaks to good versus bad character writing. Claire has no personality or character or any sense of motivation. She just goes along with whatever the men around her are doing. Naya, on the other hand, is literally a rogue agent, a lone wolf. She is a professional thief who steals valuable items from people for her own enrichment. And it's actually Ethan who has to convince her to join him and work as a double agent because she has a prior relationship with Ambrose. She's smart enough that she's like, hey, if I just show up like, hey, I'm back with no reason, then he's going to suspect something's wrong. So we should create a situation where he'll believe that I'm desperate and that's why I'm forced to come back to him. It's like she's the only character in this whole movie who's actually thought things through, who actually has some theory of mind. In some sense, I am praising the bare minimum here. She has a personality and motivations and the capacity for intelligent thought, and she acts consistently with that. But considering the last female lead didn't appear to have any of that, it's certainly an improvement. Indeed, when it comes to being intelligent, she's got most of the male characters beaten as well. I said it was predictable that she would inject herself with the virus so Ambrose wouldn't be able to kill her without presumably sacrificing years of research by destroying the virus. It was predictable, but it was a pretty smart move from her in the heat of the moment. Take that, damsel in distress trope. She don't need no man to save her. She's going to get herself out of the situation with her own quick thinking. Except, well, Ethan probably should have rescued her like a little bit. I actually don't understand what happens next because here's what I was assuming. She's injected herself with the virus so Ambrose can't kill her and therefore she's going to be able to escape with Ethan, and then there's still a time pressure because they need to get the cure within 20 hours or else she's gonna die. Meanwhile, Ambrose would of course be letting them go with the expectation that he might be able to capture her and as such get the virus back. But instead, Ethan just runs away, leaving her alone to be captured by Ambrose, and obviously he's then able to just extract the virus from her immediately. That right there seems like an unforced error. And given that once he's removed the disease, he would just be able to kill Naya without having to worry that he's destroyed the last copy of Chimera, that was certainly a stupid move from her. But fortunately, instead, Ambrose just decides to let her go with the expectation that she'll spread the disease to other people and cause a pandemic. But obviously Naya is just going to isolate herself and take her own life before that could happen, especially considering that as soon as she gets infected, her and Ethan are already discussing the possibility of him just killing her, which to me seems kind of defeatist.
I'm infected with Chimera. You know you don't have a choice. Just do it.
Just take her with you, dude. And despite Naya being a really interesting character for the first 2/3 of the film, in the final act she just gets completely ignored. She's not even in the base that Ethan has to infiltrate at the end of the film. Like I say, they just dumped her in the middle of nowhere, and it's up to the secondary characters to try and track her down so that they can bring her to Ethan once he's secured the cure and he can administer it to her. I guess in talking about the finale, I do get to end on more of a positive note because the action is really entertaining. I mean, it's more entertaining in the sense that you can appreciate how much fun they had making it.
The fight scene was great fun to do. Beating up Tom Cruise is terrific. I caught him a couple of times in his six-pack.
The actual action itself is a bit repetitive at some points. Like when Ethan is infiltrating the base, he seems to only be capable of taking down bad guys with slow motion kicks to the chest. Also, there are a lot of shootouts and that is just like flashing and loud noises. It's not as dynamic as the more hands-on action scenes. The first major action scene is when they have to infiltrate the base to destroy all the copies of the virus. Again, they do bypass the main issue of actually getting into the base itself just by using hacker magic. But there's at least a slight limitation in that the hacking is only able to keep the vent open for a limited amount of time. So he has to drop in really quickly from a helicopter hanging from a wire, secure the area, and then send the wire back up through the vents before they close. Ambrose. This is the scene where, as I already mentioned, Ambrose has an idea of what they're going to be doing already, and he's using his knowledge as a former IMF agent to think about what they're doing and anticipate it before it happens. It's quite a clever idea in that they can explain what Ethan is doing through a voiceover, but it's not just pointless exposition, it's telling us something about Ambrose's character. The only really stupid thing is, like I say, despite the fact that he seemed to know exactly what Ethan would be doing, he's not in any sense able to get the jump on Ethan, and indeed Ethan would have been completely successful with his mission if he hadn't hesitated, or if Ambrose had been slightly later. I mean, they could have at least moved the viruses from underneath the laser that is capable of just destroying them with the flick of a switch. That is poor planning. The only sense in which Ethan's crew appears to be at any disadvantage is that Luther gets ambushed and is almost blown up by an explosive. The finale in terms of action is decent. It has a few moments early on that are really stupid, which I've already addressed. There's also a bit of needless complexity at the end where Ambrose decides to change the details of the deal with McCloy at the last minute, but I can't even be bothered to talk about that. So instead, I'll just talk about the much more exciting motorbike chase and all the cool stunts there. As I was watching, I was thinking, oh yeah, this was like the start of Tom Cruise being really into doing all of his own stunts. And I was sure that there was an iconic stunt that he did at one point, and I couldn't remember what it was. And then a knife almost flew into Tom Cruise's eye, and I remembered hearing that apparently they rigged this scene up so that the knife was attached at one end to a cable. And I think if I remember correctly, it ended up going just a little bit closer to his eye than anyone was expecting, because they told the stuntman to really go for it with the stab and trust the integrity of the cable, and when he really went for it, they realized they almost put too much trust in the integrity of the cable. I'm pretty sure that's the story. I might be thinking of something else. Either way, awesome shot. What's less awesome is that it's so stupid when Ambrose and Ethan like ride their bikes into each other and then they jump at the last minute and their bikes collide with each other and they collide with each other and then their bikes explode and it sends them flying. For me, cartoon physics like that in serious action films is just never entertaining. Like I say, in the finale, Naya kind of gets ignored. It's actually quite funny because someone mentions to Ethan in the middle of the fight, like the fact that time's running out for Naya, and it's almost like you just see him suddenly remember, oh yeah, that was a thing, I forgot about that. So obviously there's the standard thing you get in action movies where he doesn't finish off the bad guy right away because he runs over to the love interest to make sure that she's okay, and while his back is turned, the dastardly villain decides to pull a gun on him. For some reason, he doesn't just shoot Ethan right away. He's like, hey, put your hands up and turn around, as if what? Is he going to be able to take Ethan hostage and somehow escape from the situation? Just shoot him out of spite and then run away. Instead, Ethan kicks a previously buried gun out of the ground and Mr. Slowest Reaction Time Ever gets shot. He lets off one shot that misses Ethan and I was like, oh, obviously that's going to go past him and hit Naya and she's going to die and it's going to be a little tragedy at the end. Nope, that doesn't happen. She's fine and the film has a happy ending. Anyway, so does that sound better or worse than the previous film? Some aspects of it were entertaining, and on balance, the characters were better written. The plot had less that I could make fun of or point to as objectively stupid, but it nonetheless was incredibly convoluted and needlessly confusing. And the use of those masks to manufacture a twist at any given moment got pretty grating after a while. The final act is simultaneously the most entertaining in terms of action, but it's also when the quality of writing takes a nosedive off the edge of a cliff, so not great. I checked my IMDb rating from the last time I watched this film and I gave it a 4. I'm going to guess that was probably a high 4 because I don't think this is that much worse than the previous film. As such, I'm going to bump it up to a low 5. Slightly worse than average and yet probably the worst of the films, but it's by no means something that you should make a point of skipping if you were, for example, marathoning the franchise. It's fine. Alright, so this is what happens when we don't record as early as we were supposed to and we end up running out of light. Now you know. I'm really glad that right between watching Mission Impossible 2 and this one, I said to someone at church that I was watching these movies and they said, oh, I've only seen Ghost Protocol, the 4th one, because that anecdotal evidence definitely bolsters my claim that this series didn't get really popular until the 4th installment. And since data is just a whole load of anecdotes, I thought I'd check out the box office, and while Ghost Protocol was in the top 3 grossing movies in this franchise, Mission Impossible 3 ranked dead last. Heist. And that's significant because if you watch these films without any mind towards the context of their release, you'd probably walk away from this one believing that this was the turning point where the franchise changed for the better. I'm not playing my cards close to my chest. This is a really, really good movie, and that's why I was sure to stress at the beginning that well-liked isn't the same thing as good. This film is about as forgotten as the box office numbers would suggest, but it might be the best film. I mean, we'll see how I feel about the later ones. Why did it do so badly at the box office? Well, I think in part this was probably a delayed reaction to the previous installment being so bad. I mean, I didn't think it was terrible, but I don't even have to wait to watch the later installments before I can say now confidently it's definitely the worst of all the films. In fact, I thought I'd check how these movies are ranked on Rotten Tomatoes, and the first two are the lowest ranked, which tracks with my opinion. Interestingly, the third film is the third lowest ranked, which is not something I'm necessarily inclined to agree with. However, what's really shocking is that every single subsequent film is ranked in the 90s, which makes me even more confident I'm right about my initial assessment I made about the franchise. According to the professional reviewers, the consensus is that the first three films are varying shades of average, but after that point they just can't stop hitting home runs. But reviewers aren't always right, so turning our attention to this film specifically, are the reviewers right to put it alongside the initial three, or does it deserve to be considered the first of the greats? By the way, just to complicate things with my own anecdote, this was actually the first Mission Impossible film I saw, so nothing I'm saying here actually applies to me personally. For me, this was my introduction to the franchise. Anyway, so if I was trying to justify my claim that this film is significantly better than the previous two, I'd probably want to look at how this film handles the thing that has annoyed me most about the previous ones. So they decide to break into the Vatican to kidnap the villain. Again, they make a point of stressing how impenetrable the place they're breaking into is.
I did remind him that the Vatican is the Vatican. A 109-acre sovereign state in the middle of Rome, surrounded by a 60-foot wall, which is monitored 24/7 with over 200 CCTV cameras.
That's not even what makes it a challenge.
I mean, I'm not saying I could break into the Vatican, but these guys do this for their day job. I feel like they should have a sense of perspective when they make statements like this. And it looks to me like the hardest part of this mission was banking on the possibility there wouldn't be a mechanic nearby, in Italy of all places. They pretend that their car has broken down to block the road in order to buy them some time, but isn't Italy just filled with mechanics? They're quite lucky that no one just fixed the car immediately. Apart from that, the real indication that Luther oversold how difficult this place is to get into is that one of the point men is just walking around as a tourist. Like, I thought them breaking into Langley in the first film was easy, but at least then it wasn't as easy as just walking in with a camera and being allowed in because you want to have a look around. Ethan Hunt is able to just wear a priest outfit and not attract too much attention. And on top of this, there's some sort of fancy gala happening in the Vatican that the villain is attending, and this female agent is again just able to walk in with the mere disguise of a fancy dress. So getting into and walking around the Vatican really isn't much of a challenge at all, if we're being honest. But this is where it gets interesting. Here, we actually get to see them make one of the franchise's iconic, in my view infamous, masks. I intentionally left it unsaid just then what actually is my least favourite part of the first two films, because I think it should go without saying. It's the masks. Every single time they've made a cheap twist out of using these masks, I've complained about it, and the more they've done it, the more I've complained. Well, here, the mask isn't being used as some sort of cheap twist because we literally see it being put on. And that was fantastic, by the way. The way they show the mask being put on and adjusted, and then they switch from Tom Cruise to Philip Seymour Hoffman is brilliant. It actually allows me to suspend my disbelief about how impossible it would actually be in reality to have such convincing masks. And helping with this is that we actually see the mask get manufactured. The agent disguised as a tourist takes some pictures of Davian, Hoffman's character, and that is then uploaded to this 3D printing device that actually produces the mask on the fly. This is really cool to see and makes Mission Impossible 2 even more annoying because how on earth was he able to print one of those masks there? Whatever. We also get to see how they imitate people's voices. Ethan pins down Davian and gets him to repeat a nonsense sentence which is used to establish what his voice sounds like. And then that's uploaded onto a device which will allow Ethan to change his voice to match. There's a nice bit of tension where the bodyguard walks in and the voice hasn't quite finished processing yet, so Ethan has to stall for time by pretending to have a coughing fit. It's a bit easy that they're able to capture Davian by just sneaking into the bathroom through a vent and his security guard isn't wasn't very vigilant about it. I don't know, I think if I had a security guard, I'd be fine with them coming with me into the bathroom, and then I'd be invulnerable. Also, in order to get Ethan, now disguised as Davian, away from Davian's security team, the female agent walks up to him and starts flirting, and then he tells his security team to go away, and that doesn't seem too suspicious because obviously he wants to flirt with this woman and not have the security around cramping his style. Overall, this was a pretty well coordinated and planned out abduction, and the big positive is how they handled the disguises in this film. I said at the end of my review of the second film that you shouldn't skip it, but honestly, in hindsight, maybe you should, because this is a much better introduction to the voice changing technology. And while the masks were established in the first one, it is nice that pretty soon after that, you get an explanation of how exactly it works, so yeah, maybe just skip number 2. This is a big positive. My main issue with the first 2 films now addressed. The disguises not being used just for cheap twists, but instead actually being used to complete a mission in a creative, clever way. Except, well, while this is a positive example, it isn't the only time that masks are used. This film starts off with Davian threatening the life of Ethan's wife. It is a flash forward that shows us Ethan in a desperate situation, and it even appears that his wife is killed. The cold open kind of leaves it a bit ambiguous as to whether or not his wife actually dies, so you might be going into this film thinking, oh, how's he going to get out of this one? Well, it turns out that actually, he's not able to get out of it. She does get shot. He kills her without ambiguity. By the way, she's got tape over her mouth. She's not able to talk. I mean, she actually would be able to talk if she tried.
Duct tape, yummy.
But yeah, if you're considering the fact that this woman isn't able to communicate with Ethan, you might already be suspicious that this film is intending to have its cake and eat it too. Have the emotional impact of, oh no, Ethan's wife died, what a shock. But oh wait, actually she's fine, that's okay, we can still have a happy ending.
Bitch, you guessed it!
Yep, that's right, it's a bad guy in a mask. More specifically, it's Davian's head of security, who failed him at the Vatican, and therefore she's being killed just to mess with Ethan. Is this disappointing? Yeah, kind of. Is this an overplayed trick at this point? Absolutely. Am I massively bothered by it? Honestly, no. See, the thing is, yeah, Ethan's wife doesn't actually die here, and yes, that means that all the potential emotional impact of her dying is not realised. And yeah, if you see the opening scene and your big investment in this movie is getting to that scene and finding out what happens to Ethan's wife and how does Ethan react to it, then this revelation would be pretty frustrating. But there is something else to get out of this scene, and that is that it's a fantastic introduction to the villain. And this villain is one of the best I've seen in a film. I mean, obviously he's played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, who is generally considered a fantastic actor, and I imagine that's in part helped by the fact he died prematurely, which adds something to his legend. But that notwithstanding, he has been in some fantastic movies and played some really interesting characters, and I don't think this is an exception. The way he's just counting up to 10 as he builds to shooting Ethan's wife in front of him, and nothing Ethan can say will make him stop. Like other great villains, Anton Chigurh for example, there's a sense of inevitability to him, as if he's a force of nature, and when he says he's going to do something evil, that's not a threat, it's a promise.
It's up to you how this goes.
Because you know what I'm going to do next? I'm going to find her. Whoever she is, I'm going to find her and I'm going to hurt her.
When he tells Ethan to do something, he doesn't give him any time to negotiate. He calls him up, tells him his terms, hangs up. There's nothing you can do. You can't reason with him. You can't catch him monologuing or making some other rookie error. It's a weird thing, but I also like the fact that Hoffman is kind of a chubby guy. Like, he's not very athletically built. But that makes him seem even more intimidating because it shows you that his power comes from something deeper rather than just a physical ability. And when Ethan is briefed on him as a threat, he's told, this guy is an arms dealer, he deals to all of the worst people in the world. And moreover, there's nothing that any agency has been able to do to take him down. And as such, he is confident in the knowledge that he is basically untouchable. There's almost a legend around this guy as a villain and a threat, and that's awesome. The actual Mcguffin for this film, the thing that Davian is selling, in some sense could not be less relevant. It's called the rabbit's foot, but it doesn't seem that lucky to me. But whatever it is, we're told that it's really valuable, and Benji, the IT guy played by Simon Pegg, says that whenever he hears about a weapon like that, he assumes it must be this theoretical idea he's heard of, which is a technological compound that is able to destroy absolutely anything. Which, I'll be honest, doesn't really make much sense to me. Like, what? Is it some sort of antimatter or something? Or a nanobot? The way he describes it makes it sound like it is something that just tears things apart on the molecular level and is basically an agent of pure destruction. But like I say, we don't really get any explanation about what this device is, in contrast to the previous films, where what they're actually fighting over is a very big deal. Here, we don't find out who made it, or what it does, or honestly, as far as I can remember, we don't even find out what actually happens to it by the end of the film. But that just shows you how compelling this villain is, that the only real purpose of this weapon is that it's something that Davian wants, and what he's willing to do to get what he wants is the entertainment value for the film. In fact, keeping the rabbit's foot unclear in terms of its actual function kind of works better, because it then allows it to symbolically represent what ultimately all evil psychopaths crave: power. And it's significant that the thing Ethan wants to know from Davian initially is what is the rabbit's foot and to whom are you selling it? And he never finds that information out. In some sense, you could say, based on the initial confrontation between them, Davian wins. Ethan never found out the information that he ultimately wanted, the information for which they bothered to kidnap him in the first place. Also, our introduction to Davian is indirect, which again makes him seem more powerful because it's like he doesn't need to get his hands dirty. The mission is that Ethan has to rescue a fellow agent who's being held hostage. The shootout is very entertaining, very hectic. Now would be a good time to mention that this movie was directed by J.J. Abrams, who I don't at all rate as a writer, but I think he's very good at visual storytelling and making what's happening on screen seem entertaining. The action just feels visceral and real, and also this whole film is very vibrant and glossy, which gives it an aesthetic that distinguishes it from the previous two films. If Mission Impossible 2 felt like classic Bond, then this feels like the same rejection of that vibe that we saw with Daniel Craig. In fact, now I think about it, Casino Royale came out in the same year as this, so maybe that's another reason why this film didn't do very well, because it was overshadowed by the excitement around a rebooted James Bond. Anyway, so taking the action up to 11, they then have a helicopter chase through a wind farm where they have to avoid all of these turbines. I'm not really sure why they couldn't have just pulled up above the turbines. There might have been a reason though. And then while all this is going on, they find out that the agent that they rescued had an explosive charge shoved up her nose and is now lodged in her brain. Ethan plans to use a defibrillator to disable the device, but before it's fully charged, the device explodes. This is really sad. You feel the impact of her death especially because Ethan was just seconds away from being able to save her, and then she dies right in front of him. And of course it makes Davian seem even more of a villain because this is such an evil way to kill someone. It's so impersonal and invasive and gross. It's more of an existential horror really to imagine having a device inside your own head that's going to kill you from the inside. What a sick dude. And they make you feel this even more with Ethan having flashbacks to training this particular agent, so you can see it affects him personally because he actually knew her. So unsurprisingly, when they have him caught later on, Ethan is already pretty mad. And it's pretty clear that Davian is the one in control here, even though he's captured, because he refuses to answer any of Ethan's questions and just proceeds to threaten his wife. It's a bit funny that the one time a villain decides to attempt threatening Ethan's family happens to coincidentally be after he recently decided to settle down. Like, imagine if one of the villains in the first two films had said this. Do you have a wife? A girlfriend? I'm gonna torture her and make her bleed in front of you and call out your name and then Ethan would just be like, stop. I don't actually have a wife or a girlfriend, sorry. And then the villain would be like, oh, okay, do you have a pet? But given that Ethan now does have a wife, and also there was that agent who was murdered by Davian, let's just say he's not a happy camper. He hangs Davian out the edge of a plane and threatens to kill him, but Davian still remains completely calm and uncooperative. Meanwhile, Luther is trying to calm Ethan down and eventually gets him to pull Davian back into the plane.
What I'm selling, and who I'm selling to, is the last thing you should be concerned about. Ethan.
Honestly, they should probably use code names, but I'm not sure that just a first name would actually be enough for Davian to find out any important information. I mean, my name's Michael. Good luck tracking down my wife based on that. But it turns out he doesn't actually need any of this information in the first place, because he already has an inside man working in the IMF, so he could just ask him for a list of agents. Maybe that's actually what he does, because when he of course escapes, he's very quickly able to send someone round to pick up Ethan's wife, and that's how we end up coming full circle back to the intro. I said that it doesn't matter that this whole wife being shot thing was a fake out, because it still shows us the kind of person Davian is. He's relentless. But of course, it is slightly less impactful when he's doing all of this knowing full well that he's not actually killing Ethan's wife. If you're wondering why he doesn't kill Ethan's wife, it's because the mole in the IMF likes Ethan, and he's, I guess, made one of his conditions of helping Davian be that Ethan and his wife aren't harmed. Anyway, so Ethan still needs to rescue his wife, so he asks that he can speak to her on the phone to confirm that she's still alive. And as the phone is held to his ear, he bites the guy, and in a scuffle, he's able to get something that allows him to pick the locks to his handcuffs. It doesn't really make sense to me that he's able to escape the handcuffs so easily, but what is very clever is that he then calls Benji and asks him to trace the number that the phone most recently called, and as such he's able to track down where his wife actually is. So he saves his wife, but he has an explosive device in his head, and when that's activated, it incapacitates him. For some reason, the way it works is that it doesn't actually explode for the first few minutes, it just causes a lot of pain. So Davian takes his time beating up this weakened Ethan, and then he goes to kill his wife in front of him. But love conquers all, and seeing this, Ethan is able to muster up the strength to push Davian into the middle of the road, and they have a bit of a fight. And then the way that Davian actually dies is that a truck comes along and drives into him. This is arguably a pretty anticlimactic death, but I do think it works quite well. This guy has been set up as completely invulnerable and always 2 steps ahead of everyone else. It actually makes sense that the way he would die would be a completely random truck coming along and driving into him, because that's something he wouldn't be able to predict. Also, he carries himself with such dignity that it's satisfying to see him suffer such an ignoble death. Overall, a great villain, easily the strongest part of this film, in fact easily the strongest part of any of these films so far, and it certainly sets the standard to beat. But there are kind of 2 villains in this film, because like I say, there is a traitor working within the IMF for Davian. I mean, the first film also had a traitor, so clearly this is nothing new. What I like that is new is that we see a lot more of the constraints from the bureaucracy in this organization. After the failed attempt to rescue that agent at the beginning, we see them subject to an oversight committee, where there is a guy running it called Brassel, who is just laying into them about how badly they mismanage things. That sets this guy up as kind of antagonistic, so it's a little bit disappointing and predictable when it's revealed that of course he's the double agent who's working for Davian. I mean, that's what Ethan's told through this secret message that he's sent by the deceased agent, and we have no reason to think that isn't true. And of course this is how Davian's able to escape, because he has someone working on the inside who could help him. Also, an obligatory Tom Cruise does his own stunts shout out. When he gets blown up and smashes into that car on the bridge, that's actually a real stunt, and in doing it, Tom Cruise broke 2 ribs. I've always really enjoyed that moment where Ethan is captured and his direct superior, Musgrave, communicates some secret information to him about the rabbit's foot by mouthing it at him. They established at the beginning that Ethan was able to read lips, so well done, good reincorporation. And then Ethan's escape from the facility is also pretty cool. I mean, he gets a lot of help because Musgrave literally slips him a weapon, which probably helps. When he steals the intercom and puts it next to the radio so that the entire station is just blasted with the sound of "We are family," it's an indication that they are starting to have a lot more fun with the tone of these films, which is certainly a positive direction to be heading. Now after this, we get the final bit of action that I haven't yet spoken about, and it's actually pretty interesting. He heads to Shanghai and he puts together the classic team everyone's familiar with, including fan favourite character Luther.
And you never slept with your little sister, right?
But here's the thing, Kay, here's why it's interesting. They don't actually really show the heist. We see Ethan come up with this elaborate plan of swinging from one skyscraper to another in order to land on the roof, and he's very lucky not to fall off. But after that, we just cut to the rest of the team outside of the facility while they wait for him. I would say that it's very easy to describe the plot of these films as being centered around certain missions that form the bulk of the narrative, and you could say function as filler. So to directly go against that and not even show us the mission taking place at all is a really interesting choice. There is a car chase afterwards where we get some exciting action and another really cool stunt. But yeah, I guess I can't really complain that this mission is truncated because the film is already plenty long, it already has more than enough action, there's nothing that really ought to be cut, and like I say, it is an interesting decision, and interesting decisions often make for entertaining movies. By the way, there's actually a twist in the tale at the end. Turns out the traitor wasn't Brassel, it was Musgrave. Now, I did have my suspicions about this because there's one line from Brassel that doesn't really make any sense. One of his charges against Ethan when he arrests him is, you got some top secret information that you should have shared with the agency, and what he's referring to there is the secret message that Ethan got from the dead agent that incriminates Brassel. And I thought, well, that makes no sense, because if Brassel is saying that it's a problem that Ethan didn't share this information, then presumably he's saying this information should have been made public. But why would he want that if that information is going to incriminate him? Unless he is indeed a good guy who is loyal and has no idea that this information would be incriminating to him because he's actually done nothing wrong and he's being set up. That would make perfect sense. It also makes sense that Musgrave would help Ethan out. Obviously he wants Ethan to be able to get the rabbit's foot so that he has to give it to Davian because they're working together. The one thing I don't really understand is why do they need the rabbit's foot stolen? My understanding was that Davian was an arms trader, meaning that he buys arms from people and sells them to other people, not that he steals them. But it turns out that the rabbit's foot is owned by this completely different group of people from whom it's now going to be stolen. And I'm like, well, who the hell are these guys who had the rabbit's foot in the first place? They seem like they would be a well bigger deal in this whole story. Also, Musgrave's motivation in this story is a bit weird. His plan is that he wants the rabbit's foot to be sold to a Middle Eastern country so that the US can use it as an excuse to invade. In fact, he's very clearly characterized as a neoconservative with an emphasis on the conservative. He says that Brassel is an affirmative action hire based presumably just on the fact he's black. Like, this guy's motivation is literally that the woke DEI hires are ruining the nation's national security. Now, I'm all for a critique of neoconservatism. Yes, this guy is a villain for wanting to use the claim that a country has WMDs as an excuse for America to expand its empire with a war of aggression. The only weird thing, of course, though, is that the whole point of Iraq is that they didn't have WMDs. That was a lie. So it doesn't really work as well as a parallel when this guy actually does want to give incredibly destructive weapons to America's geopolitical rivals. I said that the actual thing that they're fighting over doesn't really matter that much because this film is mostly about the characters. But in the specific case of Musgrave, I must admit that understanding his character is kind of conditional on actually understanding what the rabbit's foot actually does. Because if it's as destructive as Benji implies it could be, then you'd think that giving it to a geopolitical rival of America isn't going to make America any stronger on the world stage, despite what this guy seems to believe. By the way, in the end, this guy gets shot and dies. Good riddance. Although I guess he is the reason why Ethan's wife is kept alive, so they do kind of owe him for that. Although, having said that, if he hadn't betrayed them, then Davian wouldn't have escaped in the first place, so I guess they're even. I think, honestly, it probably would have been better if this whole Inside Man plot wasn't part of this film, because it kind of just leaves me asking a whole load of questions and doesn't actually add that much. It's certainly not that bad, it's just that its function in this film is to distract from all the other stuff, and all the other stuff is pretty great. I hope thus far I've adequately communicated that this film is different from those which came before it. And one big way that's the case is that Ethan is now settling down. We see him with his fiancée having a family party to celebrate their engagement, and we find out that he's now simply working behind the scenes, just training new agents rather than going out into the field himself. Now, this is when he's roped into that mission to rescue that agent to whom he feels a special sense of obligation because he's the one who trained her, and we see the tension in his home versus family life when he gets home and has to pretend that everything's okay, even though he just saw somebody die right in front of him. What I did find weird is that initially this is treated as a one-off where he's coming out of retirement just to save this woman. But after this, he seems completely willing to jump back into the field entirely with no real explanation. When they're making their plans to abduct Davian, he just jumps right in, seemingly without much thought to the fact that he's now entering back into a line of work that he presumably had some good reasons to leave in the first place. Oh, by the way, before he heads off, he and his fiancée have this cheap, quickie wedding where they have these toy rings, and when they see each other's toy rings, they laugh, and it's so quirky and I hate it. Anyway, so obviously this film is sort of about how being in a relationship in this line of work isn't a very good idea. Like, the villain's entire plan in this movie is to get Ethan to do what he wants to do by threatening his vulnerable loved ones, but that's something that wouldn't have worked in any of the previous movies because, wait a minute, I just realized in this film they say that Ethan is an orphan, even though in the first film we see his parents. Whatever, anyway, the point is that for the most part, Ethan has no loved ones that the bad guys could go after. So the only reason he has to go along with everything the bad guy says here is because he's in a relationship. Throughout the first half of the film, Luther is lecturing Ethan about how being in a relationship doing the job he's doing is a bad idea, and honestly, yeah, he's right. Oh, by the way, their neighbor is Jesse Pinkman. Obviously, he eventually rescues his wife, and there is a moment where she has to prove herself to be capable by shooting a few bad guys after Ethan has been electrocuted. It is frustrating that Ethan dies and then there is like a significant gap between when he dies and when she even tries to resuscitate him. Also, as far as I know, chest compressions can't actually restart your heart. They just keep your blood pumping in order to keep you alive until the paramedics arrive. But even if it is possible that chest compressions could restart your heart, what happens here is absolutely ridiculous. The chest compressions don't work, so in her frustration, she pounds on Ethan's chest with her fist, and this is what resuscitates him. Just for the record, if you do ever come across someone without a pulse, don't start punching them in the chest with the expectation that will bring them back to life. The whole family thing is really interesting as a choice for the third movie because, well, again, like I said at the start, it's really weird that Ghost Protocol in some sense is considered the real beginning of this franchise, and yet it occurred after the first 3 films. Considering that a trilogy is a natural stopping point for a lot of franchises, why not just stop here? Especially considering that this film underperformed at the box office, but especially because at the end of this film, Ethan's wife is alive. He is a married man. This sets things up so well to end. He came out of retirement one last time, but now he's ready to settle down with his wife and, maybe start a family. I'm glad he didn't do that. I'm glad he stuck around since the subsequent films are supposed to be better. But again, the whole reason why I wanted to talk about this franchise in particular is how weird it is, how unique it is to have a franchise that cleared an entire trilogy without being that well regarded, only to, from then on, be considered really good. And the strangeness of that is just driven home by the fact that they decided to have this third film end in such a way that it could have perfectly served as an ending for the entire series. But I guess they must have been so confident that the fourth film was worth keeping the series alive for. I just realized I didn't actually script a conclusion where I gave the film a rating or anything, so I'm just going to say this film's really good. Middling 7. I could maybe justify saying it's a high 7 because I do think the villain is really good, but yeah, I think middling 7 is probably a safer bet. I'm sure I haven't mentioned this enough times yet, so I'll say it again. The Mission Impossible franchise didn't get really popular until the 4th installment. This is when the film started getting ratings in the 90s on Rotten Tomatoes, and this is when the general public started expecting consistent quality from this series. But you know what? This film isn't even that great. I'm actually glad I was consistent on this point because as I was watching it this time, I thought, I bet the first time I watched this, I got caught up in the hype and rated this really high, but actually going back and looking at my IMDb rating from the first time I watched it, no, I gave it pretty much the same rating I'd give it now. But before I tell you what that is, I'll justify my overall assessment, and one thing I really like to do when I'm talking about a film is to compare how it handles what was in a previous film a standout element. And what did I praise to no end in Mission Impossible 3? The villain, a genuinely fantastic villain. So it's impossible, Mission Impossible if you will, when you're watching this film in the context of a marathon of this series, to not notice the massive downgrade here. I'm not gonna lie, I actually wasn't entirely sure who the villain actually was for most of this film, because there are 2 characters who both at various points are more prominent in performing the role of the villain. The first is this younger guy called Wistrom, and the second is this older guy called Hendrix, and whenever the villain is acting as a villain, they'll take turns performing that role. But Hendrix does seem to be the real man with the plan, and his plan is to start a nuclear nuclear war between the United States and Russia. Why? Well, first of all, he's characterized very vaguely as a political extremist. I assume this is so the film doesn't have to get into the nuances of his specific political philosophy. And when this is elaborated on, we find out he has the genuinely insane philosophy that mass extinction events have been good for evolution and have brought about advances for life on Earth. Therefore, he wants to manufacture an extinction event so evolution can get a good kick up the arse. The problem is, well, firstly, evolution happens over millions of years, so this guy's whole plan is to bring about some result that won't manifest until orders of magnitude beyond a human lifespan. And also, if we're looking at things on a scale of millions of years, how can I break this to you? We're already in a mass extinction event. That's not a climate alarmist theory, that's a cold hard scientific fact. 10,000 years is a relatively short amount of time compared to millions of years. Do you know how many species human beings have wiped out in the last 10,000 years? Estimates place the current rate of extinction at somewhere between 100 even up to 1,000 times more than the natural rate of extinction in the normal course of things. And there's no sign that this is slowing down, so it's quite reasonable to think that the current Anthropocene extinction event might rival that which killed the non-avian dinosaurs. So yeah, I mean, it's really funny to be like, evolution needs a mass extinction event, so I'm going to start a nuclear war that will wipe out human civilization. Well, actually, that might do more to end a mass extinction event than it would to start one. But I get that I am just nitpicking this guy's philosophy, and it's not necessarily bad writing for him to be wrong and crazy. It's just that I have to talk about this because there's nothing else I could talk about with this guy. He's just boring. Again, go back and refresh your memory of how much I praised Davian as a villain in the third film. All the brilliant ways that the film set up just how intimidating he is as an antagonist. And then appreciate the fact that Ethan Hunt and Hendrix barely even interact with each other in this film. In fact, I'm genuinely struggling to remember right now whether they even have a conversation. The villain in Mission Impossible 2 was better than this. The one interesting thing about Hendrix as a villain is that we're first introduced to him when Ethan Hunt is doing a mission and he discovers that the thing he came there for, some nuclear launch codes, have already been stolen by Hendrix. The fact that they were beaten to the punch by this guy sets up that he could be a really serious opposition that manages to always be one step ahead of them. He also blows up the Kremlin, which is pretty significant, to destroy a major symbol of the political and military power of what is a global superpower. But the issue is that after this point, nothing happens to make this guy seem more evil. I mean, he does just randomly shoot people sometimes, like there's this guy called Leonard who is dragged along with Hendrix for some reason. It doesn't really make much sense, like we're introduced to Leonard as this guy with a family, and Hendrix threatens his family in order to get him to do what he wants. But I'm actually not sure what his role even is. He just accompanies Hendrix to a meeting, then he's like, alright, I did what you wanted, now release my family. But what did he even do? And then Hendrix, or maybe that other guy, Wistrom, just shoots him for no reason.
Release Leonard's family.
Thank God.
You can thank him in person.
I actually think it might be Hendrix wearing a Wistrom mask, because later on he and Ethan have a fight and Ethan pulls off what looks like part of a mask. I'm really not sure why any of this happened though. I mean, why was this guy wearing a mask and what does it mean that he was? It kind of feels like they knew they didn't have a very compelling villain here, so they thought, well, maybe just having him do a load of mysterious random things would make him more interesting. But to me, it just comes across as tryhard, like, hey, I'm wearing a mask now. Doesn't that make me an interesting, exciting villain? I don't know if I mentioned yet that this guy is Swedish, so obviously he sounds exactly like this. That's how you do a Swedish accent, by the way. It doesn't matter how you pronounce the v's, just as long as every one of them is wrong. The other thing they did, realizing their main villain wasn't interesting, is add another one. Basically, Hendrix wants to buy some intel from an assassin lady who got it from an IMF agent at the start of the film. It's the whole opening to the movie. We see this random guy complete a mission where he steals something important and then he just gets assassinated. considering this is how they start the movie, it's kind of shocking how irrelevant this guy and the woman who assassinated him are to the rest of the plot. The main significance of it is that one of Ethan's fellow agents had some sort of romantic feelings to the guy who got killed, so now obviously she has a vendetta against his assassin. But she gets her revenge only halfway through the film when the assassin is killed. And obviously I am going to be fair here and point out that this is the coolest death ever. She gets kicked out of the Burj Khalifa. I'm scared of heights myself, but for some reason this motivates in me a morbid curiosity where I'm very fascinated with the idea of other people falling from heights. I also think it comes from there being in one of the Mortal Kombat games a lot of arenas that were elevated off the ground, and there was a certain combination of moves you could pull off whereby you would kick your opponent off the arena, sending them hurtling to the ground below for an instant win. So yeah, there was always a sense of satisfaction when you were able to pull that off, and now if I ever see anybody get kicked off of a tall platform, that activates that same sense of satisfaction in me. But satisfying as it is, obviously the fact she dies halfway through the film means that her relevance as a villain ends there. The only remaining thing I should say then is that Ethan also gets in trouble with the Russian Secret Service because they think he blew up the Kremlin. So in some sense this is interesting in that it means that one of the big roadblocks to Ethan in this film are these guys who are actually on the same side as him. They both want to stop the person responsible for blowing up the Kremlin, it's just that the Russians think that he's the one who did that. With that said, it's insane how easily Ethan is able to escape from the hospital when they first suspect him. He's lying there, injured from the blast, when a Russian official informs him that they know he's a secret agent from the United States, and they're assuming he's the one who did the attack. But then they just let him be taken away by a random nurse with no security on him whatsoever, and of course he's able to escape. Can you imagine if a Russian agent just blew up Big Ben and the police were like, "Oi, you're in a whole heap of trouble, mister. Now, go stay in this unguarded room on your own and have a good think about what you've done." And even when the guy sees Ethan in the middle of escaping, there's no sense of urgency. He's just like, "Oh, come on. Don't escape." For some reason, Ethan is very reluctant to jump into some rubbish that it seems actually would cushion his fall. I'd also think he could just climb down from the building. I mean, he's definitely done crazier things before. At least he makes up for it by doing something even more awesome and zip wiring onto the roof of a moving vehicle. And again, the Russians don't seem very upset about having just let this guy go, who they think is responsible for blowing up one of their most important buildings. Instead, they just act like annoyances for the rest of the film, occasionally getting in the way of Ethan when he's trying to do something, but they're always just minor roadblocks that he's quite easily able to escape. The film ends with him fighting Hendrix while Hendrix tries to keep hold of a suitcase that has the ability to control a nuclear weapon that he's just launched. To avoid his plan being foiled, he jumps off a multi-story car park, killing himself while holding onto the suitcase, I guess with the logic that then Ethan won't be able to reach it. Now, I will just politely point out that he didn't need to kill himself. If he just wanted to get the suitcase down on the ground so that Ethan wouldn't be able to reach it, he could have just thrown it. But of course Ethan is able to reach it. In fact, I don't think it would be very difficult for him to quickly climb down the various levels of this car park. I mean, he's done crazier things before. But instead of just climbing down, he decides to get into a car and intentionally drive the car off the edge of the car park, crashing into the floor below, which seems unnecessarily risky. It does make me realize though that if Hendrix had just thrown the suitcase down, he could have won, because then Ethan would have to go chase it right away, at which point Hendrix could just send a load of cars crashing down with the hopes of destroying the laptop and potentially making it so Ethan would be literally incapable of stopping his plan. Wouldn't that have actually been a more exciting ending if the villain was smart like that? Ethan could be climbing down when suddenly he sees a car go whizzing past as he realizes that Hendrix is trying to just crush the laptop with cars, so he has to climb down really quickly while escaping and dodging a cascade of falling vehicles. Isn't that more exciting than the villain just killing himself and only living long enough to see Ethan thwart his plan with the mere push of a button? Honestly, I think that's a pretty boring ending to a film, and then the Russians show up and realize they've been pursuing the wrong guy this entire time. How embarrassing. So I think the villain was bad, he was boring, and the final confrontation wasn't very exciting. What I will say though is that this film has a lot of different missions, and each one of them has at least one interesting idea that's implemented in it. Which is really all that I want out of these films. A perfect Mission Impossible movie would have a variety of missions where there are all sorts of different problems and they have to come up with clever solutions to those problems that they implement in a satisfying way. Now, to be fair, the first mission isn't very interesting at all. Ethan is in prison and Benji just breaks him out with hacking. Yep. Hacking solves all the problems again. No need for an interesting solution, just tap a keyboard and all the cell doors open. The two slightly interesting things though are that firstly they hack the prison speaker system and start playing a Dean Martin song. This is nice and very similar to the We Are Family scene in Mission Impossible 3 in that it shows them having more fun with the tone. Also, Ethan decides to go the wrong way when escaping from the prison and fights his way through the entire prison riot in order to rescue this guy who gave him some intel. It turns out that actually he was in the prison as part of a mission supposedly, and they need to break him out because some serious stuff is going down for which they need his expertise. So the next mission is that they have to break into the Kremlin. Again, we get a line about how impossible this is. Kremlin? I must have misheard you. It sounded like you just said we're going to break into the Kremlin. Yes, we get it. Everywhere is impossible to break into, and anytime anyone suggests you break into anywhere, suddenly it's the most impossible, crazy, inconceivable idea you've ever heard of. You wouldn't believe that actually they're just able to break in incredibly easily with, you guessed it, hacking. Yep, they just hack into their security system so that it accepts their fake IDs as legitimate and they can just walk in. Also, just like with the Vatican City, it helps that this is a situation where it's possible for someone to just walk around posing as a tourist. The one thing that I will compliment this film for is that they don't use any masks.
It's a shame we're not wearing masks. You know, like full masks. Everybody gets to wear a mask but Benji.
In fact, just jumping forward slightly, the good guys don't use masks at any point in this film. I guess they realized it was getting to be an overplayed trick. There's this one mission where they were planning to use masks, but then the machine breaks, so they have to go without them. I'm not against the masks in principle, but if we're being honest, they're pretty universe breaking, and they've been used in all sorts of hacky ways so far, so it's probably best to phase them out. Anyway, the big positive for this mission is that they use this screen that projects a fake image of the hallway they're in. I think this is a super cool gadget that I could actually imagine being used in a real covert operation. It's especially clever the way it tracks the eyeline of whoever's looking at it so that it can change the image it's presenting in order to appear 3D. And this has a nice built-in limitation where it can only work to fool one person, because if multiple people are looking at it, it's not going to be able to match what should be the perspective of all of them. It's also funny when Benji stands up in front of the camera and for a second you just have his massive head floating in the middle of the hallway. Fortunately, the security guard wasn't looking at that moment. But yeah, this is what I want. This is entertaining. Seeing a new gadget that I would have never thought of being used to solve a problem of Benji and Ethan needing to be able to sneak around this hallway without being noticed. The thing is, speaking of gadgets, well, they run into a bit of an issue when the IMF is framed for the Kremlin explosion and they enact the titular Ghost Protocol, which is basically where the IMF disbands and all of the agents are immediately disavowed. This means that they have none of their regular resources, and even the higher up guy who's trying to help them out gets killed. Although, well, they don't actually commit to this that much throughout the rest of the film as a limitation, as there's very little that they aren't able to do that you would expect them to ordinarily be capable of doing. I mean, they still have this high-tech mobile laboratory that they're able to continue using, and they even have some new gadgets that we've never seen before, like the gloves that allow Ethan to climb the Burj Khalifa. Now, yes, the idea of climbing the world's tallest building is intrinsically interesting. And while there are a lot of contrived moments like the gloves running out of power at the very last minute, at least those contrivances lead to excitement. Like when he falls a bit, that really got my heart racing. And when the rope he's climbing down from is slightly too short, so he has to swing from it into the hotel room, that's all really exciting and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But contrivance is the right word for a lot of this, and the biggest contrivance is why it is that Ethan even needs to climb this building in the first place to access the computer suite from the outside. It's that Benji isn't able to hack their security system such that they'd be able to enter this room from the inside.
Well, the firewalls on this building server are military grade. I mean, this would be a cinch if I could call Yusuf back at headquarters, but Yusuf doesn't exist anymore, and neither do we. I could hack it, but it would take too long.
Then hardwire in.
And there's 4 layers of next-gen security between us and the server room. There's no way we can get to it from inside.
Now, I don't know exactly what happens in the Burj Khalifa. I understand there are probably billionaires inside it. It probably has a not unserious level of security. But considering that we just saw them quite effortlessly hack the Kremlin in this film, it's quite hard to believe that Benji wouldn't be able to hack this building. Obviously, I shouldn't complain here. I don't like how hacking has been used to solve basically every problem. I'm just saying that if they're going to create a situation where hacking isn't an option and they need to come up with some other solution, it probably should have been when they're breaking into a top secret government-run base rather than just this comparatively less top secret building. And while the spectacle of all this is very entertaining, I must admit that I've just finished watching this movie, and I honestly can't actually remember what their plan was, or even what goal they were hoping to achieve. I'm actually not even sure why Ethan needed to break into the computer room. Their stated goal is to redecorate 2 rooms in the Burj Khalifa because the assassin lady and Hendrix are supposed to be having a meeting, and their goal is to make it so that instead of having a meeting with each other, they instead end up meeting with the IMF agents. This is where the masks were going to come into play if the machine hadn't broke, because their plan was to make themselves actually look like the other party in the meeting, but instead they just decide to roll with it and bank on the possibility that neither side has actually seen what the others look like. Fortunately, that's correct. But here's some questions. Why are they meeting in the Burj Khalifa, of all places? How exactly does hiring a room in the Burj Khalifa for a top secret meeting work? How does hiring 2 rooms and disguising one as the other work? Why are some agents able to hire 2 rooms at very short notice in one of the most famous buildings in one of the most expensive cities in the world when they've been cut off from the majority of their resources? But also, why are they doing this? What's the point in this whole switcheroo? If it's just to make contact with the people they're supposed to pursue, why don't they just let them meet each other normally and then follow them after the meeting's done? Which is, by the way, what Ethan ends up doing anyway. He sees Hendrix leaving the meeting and just decides to follow him, even ends up crashing a car into him. But it leaves me thinking, how would this have gone any differently if they'd not gone to any of this effort, just hung out in the lobby and then waited for the meeting to be over so that they could follow them then? I'm willing to entertain the possibility I've missed something here because I have been known to miss things in these films, but usually these would be like small things. Not the entire plan of one of the central missions of this incredibly famous film. If I have literally no idea why they were doing this or what they were hoping to achieve in doing this, I feel like the film has to bear some responsibility for failing to adequately communicate that information to me. After this, Ethan meets up with the prisoner he rescued at the start of the film. I assume this guy would be reincorporated in an interesting way, but he's really not. He's just a minor help of not that much significance. This film really wouldn't be very different at all if he wasn't in it, which makes me wonder, why did we even have that scene of Ethan going out of his way to rescue him in the first place? And then we get the final mission, which is in Mumbai, and to show it's in Mumbai, we get an Indian version of the Mission Impossible theme. Now, the thing I like about this mission is that they have this plan for Brandt, one of the other agents, to jump into a giant fan, which looks like it would kill him if he actually hit it, but they're going to catch him with magnets. This is a really good idea for your prototypical Mission Impossible stunt. Something that looks on the surface like it would be purely suicidal, but actually they have a clever plan to make it survivable, and it's the thing that he needs to ultimately do in order to achieve the objective of the mission. But again, the context around all of this confuses me. What is this giant fan, and why does it have all these magnets around it such that Brandt can be caught? Also, I can't really remember why they're in Mumbai here. I think it's got something to do with a satellite, and the positioning of this satellite will affect whether or not a nuclear weapon can be launched. So the female agent needs to seduce this rich Indian guy so that she can get him to give her the codes that allow them to control the satellite. To this end, Ethan decides to bank on the theory that Indian men are cucks, so he starts making out with this woman in front of him, hoping that will work towards seducing him, and hey, it works. But yeah, so I guess the basic plan here is that they need some codes, and Brandt has snuck into this place where he's going to be the one inputting the codes, but they need to seduce this guy first so they can find out what they are.
Next time, I gotta seduce the rich guy.
Unfortunately, despite some interesting action scenes, there were no moments in this film where I had a very strong sense of, oh, here's the goal, and here's why this goal is important, and here's why the plan that they're enacting will help them achieve that goal. But without all that, it doesn't matter how exciting the action is in these missions if I don't know ultimately what these missions are in service of in the first place. Now, let's circle back to the big question you'll be wondering if you remember the ending to my review of the third film. Where on earth is Ethan's wife? Like I said, the whole thing of that film is that it was potentially the final film in a trilogy, and it could have wrapped things up perfectly with Ethan settling down. But instead, we now have Ethan fully out in the field, seemingly with no commitments at home, and we find out quite quickly that apparently he and his wife were divorced. Which is pretty sad, but I guess it makes sense as the best option to bring Ethan back into the field so that you can continue the series, so whatever, we can just move past that and accept that this is what happens when you try to keep a series going indefinitely. Except during the Dubai mission, Brandt gets into an argument with some of the other agents, and Ethan suggests that he might not actually be that reliable. And this is when we find out that Brandt actually did used to work as an active field agent, and he was given a mission to protect a man and his wife, and he actually knew that there was a threat to them. But his orders were not to intervene unless absolutely necessary, so he held off, and then the wife ended up being killed. Now obviously the way I've presented it here makes it, I imagine, pretty obvious to you where this is going. But actually, within the context of the film, it was genuinely surprising to me when Brandt said,
I couldn't face another life or death situation after that.
So what happened to the husband?
Never saw him again. Until 2 days ago in Moscow, when the secretary introduced me to Ethan Hunt.
We also find out that Ethan took revenge on the gang, and this is how he ended up in prison at the start of the film, which is nice because there was some sense of there being a mystery about why exactly he was in that prison in the first place. Now, this is a nice shock reveal, and it definitely adds something to Brandt's character, and I don't want to take away from that, but while I might not want to take anything away from it, I think it's fair to say the film doesn't add much to it. There isn't really much interaction regarding this point between these two characters for the rest of the film. Also, I will say that they did a good job earlier characterizing Brandt as an apparent rookie, where he's constantly asking Ethan questions about how does he do the job he's doing. And those types of questions to me gave the very strong vibe of someone who's new to all of this, rather than someone who's actually worked as a field agent before and then quit because they had a mission that went wrong and left them disillusioned with that line of work. Like, going back and watching this again, I can't imagine that there would be very many indications that Brandt has this specific relationship to Ethan. It's not like this revelation adds some fantastic clarity to that which we've seen so far. I suppose I should just give the rest of the team a brief mention. Benji's back in a much more significant role now that we're told he's passed his field exam and can actually be a more involved agent, although they make a joke about the fact he still isn't doing that much. Interestingly missing is Luther, who only shows up right at the end where he makes fun of Ethan for his cringe one-liners.
You actually said that out loud. Mission accomplished.
I said it.
I'm still corny, Ethan.
I mean, I wasn't going to say anything, but since this film thinner lampshade it, I did find that line incredibly unnatural and out of character when Ethan said it. The way this film ends, there is the suggestion that this is going to be the official team that they maintain going into the next film. By contrast with the previous films, except for Luther, there's not been any continuity with the team members at all. But part of this continuing team is Brandt, so right at the end, he and Ethan need to hash out their outstanding drama, and it's resolved with the news that Ethan's wife isn't actually dead. I'll be honest, I'm not sure how I feel about this. I mean, on the one hand, his wife actually being dead kind of undoes the whole point of the previous film. But on the other hand, the actual explanation we're given, that he faked his wife's death so that she could go off and live her own life and they could separate such that she wouldn't be entangled with any of the dangers that come from his line of work, well, that's nonsense. At the end of the last film, it was strongly implied that Ethan retiring permanently was certainly an option. So if we're now finding out that he had to make a choice between continuing to do his work and being able to maintain the safety of his wife, why did he choose his work over the woman he loves. The whole thing just kind of massively undercuts their relationship if he supposedly loves this woman, but when he realized that his line of work was putting her in danger, instead of sacrificing his work, he decided to sacrifice her instead. I actually think the initial explanation of divorce was a much better one because that actually makes sense. It means that Ethan didn't have to choose between balancing his family life, which he loves, and his work life, which he feels drawn to. Rather, we could just assume that actually he couldn't handle a quiet family life. It wasn't making either of them happy, so for the benefit of both of them, they got a divorce amicably and went their separate ways. The suggestion here is that they would both be happier with each other, but that isn't viable when Ethan continues to do his job, so he decided to keep doing his job and fake her death, and I think that's nonsense. Anyway, as for my rating, it's a middling 6, a full point lower than the last one. And I'm pretty resolute in that opinion since I've been very consistent on it. See, I couldn't remember how I rated this film the first time I watched it, so going into it this time, I was assuming, oh, it's probably a 7. I mean, everyone likes it, it's considered to have been the start of the golden age for this franchise. But having actually watched it with a critical lens, I've given it a 6. And then I went to check my IMDb rating, and I also gave it a 6 the first time I watched it, even though I definitely would have expected it to be a 7 going into it the first time. So this is definitely a 6, and honestly, when I think about the significance of some of the criticisms I've made, I've almost convinced myself this should actually be a low 6. But I'll be generous. It might have some issues in terms of plot, and certainly the villain is insanely weak, but at least there are some entertaining moments, and there's nothing here that massively bothers me. Actually, no, you know what? Low 6. If I'm being honest, this film does have some pretty serious issues, and the more I think about how boring the villain is, and how important a good villain is for a movie like this, the more it annoys me. If this was a Marvel film, I'd consider it average, and I can't show favoritism just because I prefer the franchise overall. No, if I'm assessing the overall quality of this film as a film, it's a low 6. For me, there's one moment that really stands out in Mission Impossible Rogue Nation in a negative way. It's that scene where Ethan is running away from the Syndicate and he's running down this long, straight hallway and the bad guys are behind him shooting at him and they miss. How on earth could they miss? How could they possibly miss? The first time I watched this movie, I was with my dad and we were both just like, oh, come on. I have a pet peeve, which I think should just be a regular peeve, but it seems to be quite unique to me. And that is about franchises with hyper-competent, badass fighters who, nonetheless, seem to get bailed out far too often by luck. Because it leaves me thinking, well, how many times can they actually get lucky?
Ethan Hunt is a gambler, and one day his luck will run out.
Thing is, so far the series has actually been pretty good in that regard. There aren't that many moments from the first 4 films where the characters are totally reliant on luck. See, I actually have a beef with the very popular John Wick movies, which is basically what I've just described here. He's supposed to be this incredible assassin that's like legendary, but in all the films he's constantly in situations where he would die if something just didn't conveniently happen at the last minute to save him. In most of this franchise, by contrast, there aren't that many moments like that. In this film though, they mention luck so many times that you'd almost think it's some sort of theme.
Your unorthodox methods are indistinguishable from chance, and your results, perfect or not, look suspiciously like luck.
But there is no thesis statement on this, no deep exploration of the nature of luck and the significance of it as a factor in a mission going well. Instead, I don't know, is this just the film lampshading one of its biggest problems? Because in this film in particular, it stood out to me how often the characters do rely on luck. Like, I've already mentioned the most egregious example. There is no way that Ethan should have been able to survive here. And even getting to this point requires a huge amount of luck because he gets captured and he's only able to escape because there happens to be a double agent in the room. I will give credit where it's due. The way that he escapes from being bound by contorting his body is genuinely awesome. Like, that's what I enjoy seeing in movies, when a character who I'm supposed to be impressed by gets himself out of difficult situations by doing something impressive. I know that I couldn't do this weird upside down climby thing that Ethan does, but I could be just as likely as him to have something luckily work out in my favor. Because that's the whole point of luck, right? It's down to chance, not merit, so it's not impressive. It's also convenient that the bad guy's plan in the first place was to capture him when they could have just killed him right here. Now, like I say, generally these films are very good at not having characters just be bailed out by luck, at least not in distractingly obvious ways. So while this film, relatively speaking, is a bit of a downgrade, it doesn't actually have that many moments overall that leave me saying, oh come on, what are the odds? So I can transition to talking about the Morocco heist with the caveat that I'm not necessarily saying that this heist has a huge amount of luck in it. It's slightly more complicated than that. The good news is, if you remember one of my big complaints of the previous film, none of that applies here. I understood the assignment perfectly. There is a list of bank account details that have money in them that could be used to launder that money for nefarious ends. So that's a big positive. I understood what was happening here. I mean, initially I didn't understand what was happening, but that's because in the beginning, even Ethan doesn't know exactly what this is about. But he does know it's important, so he comes up with this plan to break into this facility in Morocco, and again, of course, we get an elaborate explanation of just how impossible this is.
So why hasn't Lane just sent someone to steal it?
Oh, he has. He sent me. And I can tell you, it's impossible.
And because this series has been going on for a while, we get an explanation of why they can't use the obvious things they might have used before, like masks. And we get all of the various different obstacles they're going to have to get past, like a combination lock and another combination lock. But the real thing that we are told there is absolutely no way to fool is the gait analysis, which will analyze the exact way that you walk in order to determine if you really are who you say you are. This is kind of funny to me because surely the thing that would really give you away is the fact that you are very unlikely to be the exact same height as the person you're impersonating. Like, I just find it really funny imagining Ethan Hunt thinking that he's fooled the system, and then the security guards are just like, wait a minute, that 6-foot man who's suddenly 5.5 foot for some reason is walking slightly different than usual. Wow, thank God they invested in expert gait analysis. And I don't even know if this makes sense scientifically, because obviously the way that we walk varies depending on our situation. If you're in a hurry, or you're tired, or you're nursing a minor injury, all of that is going to affect your gait. So presumably this system can account for all of the natural variability in the walking patterns of a specific individual, while nonetheless being able to identify the exact moment where someone is walking sufficiently differently from how they usually do, such that they must be a different person. Anyway, so all of this is just to say that this gait analysis is presented as this impossible thing to fool. And then we get a quite funny line.
Bottom line is, there's no way into that terminal unless your profile is pre-installed in the security system.
Profile? Where the profile's stored?
Oh wow, so it's impossible to break into unless you can pre-install your profile into the security system. So, you know, just the very thing that we've seen them do before, where they have hacked into security systems so that they can get in with their false credentials. It's just really funny for them to explicitly dismiss the old trick of using masks, only to end up circling back to the equally old trick of hacking. However, fortunately, this isn't quite the cop-out it sounds like, because you can't just hack the computer remotely, you have to manually insert a new profile into the computer by breaking into the computer itself. Problem is that this computer is underwater to keep it cool, so Ethan is going to have to swim underwater in order to switch the profiles by changing some cards around. And to add an extra limitation, there is a metal detector, so he can't bring an oxygen tank in, and as such he's going to have to hold his breath. They actually give him this wetsuit which tracks how much oxygen he has in his system, presumably just so that we, the audience, can see that. But what's weird is that initially the oxygen level is registering in the 90s, but air itself only has 20% oxygen in it. So when we take in a breath, that only puts 20% of oxygen in our lungs. And this got me thinking, considering all of the effort that they're putting into this operation, why didn't any of them think about giving him pure oxygen to breathe in advance? In the film, his time limit is like 2 to 3 minutes, because that's how long a person can typically hold their breath. But people have been able to hold their breath for more like 15 minutes by breathing pure oxygen beforehand. Which makes sense. If air is 20% oxygen, oxygen, then breathing 100% oxygen would give you 5 times more, so you could hold your breath for 5 times longer. If the writers would have thought of this beforehand, then they could have made the obstacle even more complicated, thus forcing the IMF crew to come up with a creative solution to it, you know, the way that entertaining heists should be. Also, in these films, they often introduce a whole load of different security measures in order to make it sound really complicated, but then they only end up focusing on one thing, and everything else just gets kind of ignored. Like, the 2 combination locks were treated as a significant issue worth mentioning, but then they just get solved like they're nothing. The only big drama is that Ethan and Benji need to sync up their watches so that Benji doesn't go through the gate analysis before Ethan has had time to switch the profiles around. But Ethan gets knocked away from the computer and then he gets the cards mixed up. And as far as I can tell, he just guesses which one to put in and it happens to work. So there's our old familiar friend Luck doing its thing again. Also, he does run out of oxygen and get saved at the last minute by a female accomplice, but I'm not going to call that luck because I think it does make sense that if he's been in there for too long, she would come in and rescue him. As a final point for this whole scene, considering it's the central heist of the entire movie, it is actually quite short. Like, comparing this to how long he spent hanging from the ceiling in the CIA in the first movie, this feels very much like they just rushed through it. So if they rushed through it, you might be rightly wondering, well, where's the rest of the plot here then? And it kind of reminds me of Mission Impossible 2, where if you remember, I was saying that there was just lots of confusing stuff happening. Here, what's happening isn't confusing, but it does have that same vibe because everyone's constantly under suspicion of betraying each other. It's basically the main plot of the film, not really what's happening, but what's the motivation behind what's happening. A minor example of this is that we return back to the government oversight significant to the third film. In this case though, rather than it being internal, it's the CIA pushing for the IMF to be disbanded by the government. This is a bit complicated because I would generally say that I don't like it when elected officials or representatives within an elective democratic government are presented as villains for opposing an unelected covert organization. Because, you know, like I said at the start of this video, actually these agencies tend to do some really evil things. Although the big thing you might notice here is that hypocritically, it is someone from the CIA who is making these accusations. I do like how they refer back to the first film when Ethan Hunt infiltrated Langley, because it does make sense that the CIA would be a little bit annoyed about that. And by the way, this isn't just something that's mentioned as a possibility. No, it literally happens. At the start of the film, the IMF gets disbanded, and this is one of the major dramas. Brandt ends up working for the CIA, and Benji does too, even while he maintains contact and an allegiance with Ethan. Ethan has just become a rogue agent actively pursued by the CIA, while Luther has become so disillusioned that he's abandoned his line of work entirely. We get to see here just how skilled Ethan Hunt is as an agent, as he's not only able to evade the CIA for 6 months, but he even intentionally leads them to discovering certain clues which point to the true villain of this movie and reveal that Ethan is actually a good guy. But instead, they're so resistant to legitimizing Ethan's side of the story that they actually authorize the order to kill him on sight instead of just trying to capture him. So then obviously Brandt is like, hey, I need to go and help out Ethan, but also I kind of need to bring him in alive to avoid him getting killed. So there's an ambiguity around whether he's really on Ethan's side, and if he is on Ethan's side, is he betraying him anyway for the greater good? In fact, at one point, Ethan and Brandt have a full-on argument which leads to him cooling the CIA director in order to betray Ethan.
I can't see another way.
Neither can I. But we do what we have to do for our friends, right?
So, oh no, he totally betrayed Ethan's trust. Except, wait, no, he didn't. It turns out that actually, he was doing this as part of Ethan's plan to ultimately get the upper hand. So here, you can see there's a kind of cheap entertainment value in having characters do things that seem like they might be suspicious, maybe disloyal, but then it turns out actually they were doing it for totally different reasons than we initially thought, due to information that we weren't aware about. The thing is, this sort of undercuts a lot of the character moments here. Like, when Brandt and Ethan have an argument, Brandt accuses Ethan of putting his ego above doing what's ultimately good for the mission. That's quite a pointed criticism, and could reflect a genuine genuine disagreement between these two characters. But the problem is, that argument was building up to Brandt betraying Ethan, but then we find out he didn't actually betray Ethan and was in fact working with him the whole time, which kind of makes you think, so what actually was the deal with that character conflict? Was that actually real? Was that part of an act? At least Benji is always reliable. Hunt actually kind of ends up becoming like the unofficial IMF secretary, as he gives Benji some gadgets which communicate to him a mission that he wants Benji to do. And then when Ethan tries to let Benji go back to the CIA, Benji refuses and is like, hey, no, I'm your friend. I'm going to stick with you through thick and thin. So yeah, I like the character of Benji. I like that he's loyal. I like seeing him go off and do a little mission for Ethan. He's the one person in this film where we're not constantly wondering, oh, what are his real motivations? Although even then they do a little bit of a trick where they make us think maybe he actually doesn't like Ethan anymore.
Ethan Hunt is still out there in the field, and I am stuck here answering for it. We are not friends. I owe him nothing.
A few moments later.
Because it's just another thing I will have to lie about in my weekly polygraph.
And then to just wrap up on all of this IMF vs CIA mutual suspicion, the guy in the CIA who was the big pusher for getting rid of the IMF ends up at the end of the movie becoming the new secretary for it, because he's now seen that they have value. Now, to be fair, the subplot isn't so much about backstabbing and betrayal. Most people's positions are pretty well communicated and they are consistent with that. But even then, you can see that a lot of the drama in the plot here just comes from people's loyalties being in doubt. Now, obviously this film does have a plot in itself and unambiguous villains beyond just allies turned enemies. See, the villains in this film are called the Syndicate, who I believe are mentioned in the previous film, but only very briefly. Our introduction to them is pretty fantastic, honestly. Basically, Ethan walks into a record store where he is instructed to go play a record which contains his mission briefing. I haven't yet said that I do enjoy all of the creative ways that they introduce these briefings in the film. And in this case, it warrants a special mention because it turns out that this message isn't actually from the IMF at all, it is from the Syndicate. And Ethan then looks outside of the booth to see the villain for this film murder an innocent woman. So here we not only get to see how the Syndicate are evil, but we're also told their motivation. They're a covert organization that undermines Western interests by supporting those who oppose the West. Now, I realize this isn't actually evil because Western interests are far from an unalloyed good, but it's a Hollywood movie, whatever. Anyway, so Ethan works out that this rogue nation is operating by recruiting former agents of other intelligence agencies. As such, he's looking for operatives who are missing, assumed dead. Anyway, eventually we find out the entire origin story for the Syndicate. Basically, it's led by this kind of intimidating South African dude called Solomon Lane, who worked for the British government until they made him do loads of evil things and then he became disillusioned with them. In fact, it's a bit more complicated than that. There's this one guy, Attlee, working within the British intelligence who floats the idea of starting an organization that's based on recruiting foreign agents. And the idea was that this agency could act with less accountability because it would be made up of individuals with no official allegiance. It is a bit weird that the Syndicate is treated as evil for having been established with no accountability, and yet when the IMF is attacked for that exact same thing by the CIA, it's suddenly treated as a completely illegitimate criticism. But in principle, I like this idea that the government agencies are the ones who actually created the Syndicate, which is now working against them. There's something poetic about that. What I'm less wild about is the way all this information is revealed. Like, basically, Ethan Hunt just discovers all of this information off screen and then we're just told it by him. So Attlee deletes some files and Ethan's just like, well, obviously the reason he deleted them is because they would be incriminating to him because he's the one who started the Syndicate. And when Lane decides that he needs to kidnap the Prime Minister in order to gain access to the funds that were put aside for the Syndicate, Ethan says that his big secret plan is just going to be to go along with everything that Lane wants. But him having a secret plan isn't very satisfying, is it? Because it means that most of what's important here is just discovered off screen. In fact, while some of this information appears to be confessed by Attlee on screen, we actually find out that this is just Hunt impersonating Attlee. Isn't that massively less impactful when we know it's just Ethan pretending to be this guy? It kind of gives the same vibe as winning an argument with an imaginary person in your head. Yeah, that's right, I'm the bad guy, and let me tell you how evil I am and the specific details of my evil plan. Now, obviously, in this case, what Ethan is saying is accurate, but it just seems, I don't know, a little bit cringe to have this whole cosplay routine where you disguise yourself as somebody else in order to confess to the things that you already know that they did. In fact, this might well hurt the credibility of what he's saying here, because impersonating someone in order to make a confession could very obviously make that confession seem less legitimate to an impartial observer. But more to the point, again, the huge issue here is that in order for Ethan to be confessing all this stuff as Atlee, that means that he must have already worked all of this stuff out off screen, and seeing the hero solve the problem off screen, which is to say not seeing it at all, isn't very good. And speaking of solving things off screen, you may be wondering, what exactly was Hunt's plan here? Well, okay, basically Benji gets kidnapped, so Ethan is forced to steal the bank details so that he can give them to the Syndicate in exchange for Benji's safe release. But Ethan then reveals that he's actually memorized all the details and he's destroyed any documentation of what the details are apart from in his head. So this gives Ethan a lot of bargaining power and he's able to force Lane to release Benji, and indeed he's actually able to run away, with Lane not wanting to kill him because then he'd lose access to all that money. Instead, Solomon chases him down a manhole where he suddenly discovers that actually there was a big glass box waiting for him and he's now trapped in that. Now, to be fair, this plan doesn't involve too much luck, which is usually the problem with elaborate plans like this. I can believe that Ethan planned this out and was confident that each step of the plan would lead to the next one logically. What bothers me though is that we don't see this plan being formulated, which means there's no satisfaction in seeing it being realized. Usually these movies set up an issue and then we see their solution to this issue being enacted as they deal with it. Here, the villain is just defeated totally unexpectedly out of nowhere because it turns out they had this secret plan all along. And I guess part of the reason this annoys me is that I know that without this surprise factor, there'd be nothing to enjoy here. It kind of reminds me of those terrible Now You See Me movies, where the way it ends is always that these alpha magicians just set up this ridiculous trap that perfectly defeats the enemy, and then at the end they just gloat about how fantastic their scheme was that nobody could have foreseen. Except here, it doesn't even have the benefit of it being an elaborate trap, which would at least be kind of interesting. When you actually think about it for a second, you realize it's a pretty terrible ending that the main antagonist is just defeated by being tricked into jumping into a box. Now, if you're looking at the chapters in the timeline, you'll notice this is one of the longer ones, especially compared to how long I've been talking about this film in particular. Now, here, I could divide things, but I think it's worth keeping this as one singular chapter about this idea of betrayal and disloyalty, just to show how reliant the film is on this as a plot mechanic. Because there is another central character in this film who has dual loyalties. Her name is Ilsa Faust, and she is the woman who was working with the bad guys at the start of the movie and helped Ethan escape. Okay, cool, so she's on Ethan's side, right? Awesome. But then she refuses to leave with him and said that she's going to stay with the Syndicate instead. So alright, she's a double agent who's continuing to work with the Syndicate. But then the next big scene is when the Syndicate go to assassinate a head of state at the opera in Vienna. Honestly, this segment has so much going on that it's pretty much impossible to describe what's happening without making it sound needlessly complicated. Ethan and Benji are walking around, Benji in a computer room, Ethan backstage, and Ethan discovers Faust is there and she's going to be the one to assassinate the target. So alright, so she's clearly a villain then. If she's actually willing to kill someone for the Syndicate, that makes her pretty bad. But then he has this elaborate fight with a really tall guy, and meanwhile, there's another totally different assassin on the other side of the room. So everyone's all just trying to deal with their own issues all at once. Eventually Ethan does just kill the tall guy. Then he shoots at the target so that he moves and the shots end up missing. Then he shoots the assassin and Faust gets away. It turns out that Faust was forced to do this as a test of loyalty. And the other two assassins were there so that one could kill her if she didn't follow through, and then the other could kill the target anyway. Speaking of killing the target anyway, it turns out a car bomb was planted so that even after all of that, he just drives away and gets blown up. But yeah, here there is just a massive sense of quantity over quality. Like, this film is just including a whole load of variables to make it interesting, rather than properly developing one streamlined plot. I did like the way the instrument turned into a rifle though. That was cool. The thing is, I didn't really like the character of Faust though. She very much reminded me of Mac from the 4th Indiana Jones movie. Do you remember that movie? There was this character called Mac in it whose whole shtick was just that he was constantly betraying people. He would always go against Indy, and then in the next scene he would defect back to his side. It's a very similar vibe with this woman, although honestly I'd be more annoyed with her if I was in the Syndicate. She's somehow able to survive their wrath, despite obviously being a traitor based on how things have gone down every time she's been involved in a mission. And it's certainly a pretty convenient asset for Ethan that there is a woman in the Syndicate who has suspect loyalties. Except maybe she's a triple agent. There is a strong sense that she might actually be pretending to betray the Syndicate and work with Ethan in order to gain his trust. Most of Ethan's friends don't trust her for this very reason.
What the hell? She's bad news.
And it turns out that his friends were right, because after Ethan's stolen the important bank details, she then just steals them from him and runs off. I do enjoy the motorbike chase, that's kind of a highlight, and I especially like that Ethan gets incapacitated and as a result he loses some of his motor function, so he's just fumbling around. What I don't like though is the inexplicable, enduring loyalty of these two characters, Ethan and Faust, to each other. Faust protects Ethan by claiming that he's dead, and Ethan is so unwilling to hurt Faust that he crashes his own motorbike to avoid running her over. Again, it's just kind of dumb. I don't believe two hardened agents in this situation would have such sentimental feelings for each other that would override the fact that clearly most of the time they have completely conflicting priorities and motivations. The one thing I will say is that it is refreshing that despite Faust being an attractive woman, they don't really try to imply any romantic chemistry between her and Ethan. I haven't mentioned the woman thing for a while because it's not really been an issue, but yeah, well done. Very good making there be a woman character who has a personality and isn't just defined by her romantic allure to the main character. But as refreshing as that might be, all of this tension over who's betraying who and who's really working for which side gets pretty damn stale. It turns out, by the way, that Faust is actually betraying both Ethan Hunt and Solomon Lane because she's actually still loyal to British intelligence. However, the guy that she's working for more specifically, Atlee, actually screws her over and also suggests that she should kill Ethan in order to regain the Syndicate's trust. Also, in him deleting the bank details to cover up his involvement in creating the Syndicate, he leaves her very awkwardly presenting some empty information to Lane, and him thinking, hey, you've clearly just betrayed me again. I assume, by the way, that this character of Atlee was created as a bad apple so that all the institutional problems with the British Secret Service can be dumped on him. Because these films don't seem particularly interested in suggesting, rightly, that these types of organizations are fundamentally corrupt. But yeah, that's the main plot right there. Faust does eventually realize that Ethan's the only one who hasn't threatened her life or obviously betrayed her, so she decides to side up with him eventually. So I guess Ethan was ultimately right to trust her, but it's hard to think that at moments when she's right in the middle of betraying him and he has no reason to think there's some deeper reason for that. With all this said, I can't imagine you disagree that this movie is clearly incredibly reliant on just manufacturing tension out of these concerns of distrust, disloyalty, who are people really working for? And honestly, I'm just not a huge fan of that. It seems super cheap to me and way too easy as a method to make it seem like something's happening when really not that much is. Anyway, I will end on a positive note. I do enjoy the opening scene very much. I love how we get to see the crew working together on this heist, and this has one of Tom Cruise's all-time best ever real-life stunts where he's actually strapped to the outside of this aeroplane as it takes off. Also, I'd probably say this film has the best intro to the title sequence so far. And I enjoy how after this moment we see someone talk about Ethan Hunt as if he's this legendary character. All of that's really good, and that's all in the first 5 minutes or so. But honestly, this is going to be a very short chapter because all I wanted to do here was talk about the things I haven't covered, and I pretty much covered everything when I spoke about the tension around the various loyalties in this film. And I think that's a shame, that this whole film can easily be identified as just a one-trick pony. I made a big deal out of how proud I was that my rating for the fourth film was consistent consistent both times I watched it, that this time I didn't think it was that great, and I had rated it not that great. Well, here I'm afraid that isn't true. My IMDb rating for this film was a 7, meaning the first time I watched it I thought it was reasonably good, whereas now you can probably tell based on what I'm saying about it, I don't think it's that great at all. The real question is whether this film is better or worse than the fourth one. The big negatives would be that I don't like how a lot of the conflict felt forced and one note. I also don't like how many problems were solved through luck here. However, the positives are that I did enjoy some of the action moments and the villain was much more interesting. I guess I do believe that a film is only as good as its villain, because for me, the villain being better than the previous film pushes this one above it. But not that much better. For me, this is only going to be a middling 6. When I think about all the criticisms I've had, I don't think I can rate it any higher than that, and that's disappointing. Fun fact, by the way, this is also the longest gap there's been between me watching the film for this review and me being sat here now actually recording that review, because after I finished it, I just had no motivation to talk about it whatsoever, so it took me a good while to crank out the script, and in that time, I ended up having to go on holiday. Well, I chose to go on holiday for a long weekend, so I've only just got back here now to record this. That's also, by the way, left me feeling very drained, so I hope that didn't come across too much in the recording. I also feel as if the camera is slightly blurred, but again, feeling drained and a little bit unmotivated going into recording this. I was just like, I can't even be bothered. Like, the last thing I want to deal with right now is technical issues. So I apologize if for some reason the focus is a little bit, I mean, I'm looking at it now, I'm like, that looks kind of to me. I also don't exactly like how I'm framed, but these are the issues we have in life. Also, I didn't even like this t-shirt. This would be good for a Breaking Bad review, but it's not a great Mission Impossible review thing. I guess it's good that the film is sufficiently memorable that I was actually able to write a script about it, even as I was writing most of that script significantly after having seen the film. But it's not a good thing, obviously, that when I initially watched the film, I felt so disinterested in talking about it that there was such a significant gap between me finishing it and me writing about it in the first place. Dead Reckoning was the first Mission Impossible title to feature that occasionally infamous qualifier, Part 1. You know, ever since Harry Potter split Deathly Hallows into Parts 1 and 2, it's become established that you can end a big franchise by splitting the final installment into 2 parts. I mean, like, how many times have they done that, or at least begun to do it? Harry Potter, Twilight most unnecessarily, The Hunger Games, they were planning on doing it with Divergent before that got cancelled. Infinity War and Endgame were initially going to be released as Infinity War Parts 1 and 2, and of course Dead Reckoning was initially titled Dead Reckoning Part 1. In the case of this series though, that would have been very significant because these films haven't had much continuity between each one. It's not quite as extreme as the James Bond films where, until Daniel Craig came along, you could literally watch the films in any order and it didn't matter, or skip whichever ones you liked. This is to me an important part of the identity of the James Bond franchise, and yes, I do dislike the Daniel Craig films on principle for having gone against this. Mission Impossible does have a clear sense of one film following on from the other, but nonetheless you could actually start watching this series at any point and not feel like you've missed that much of what came before. Mission Impossible 2 was definitely its own self-contained story. The third film, again, a new villain, a new threat, nothing really carries over. The fourth film has lots of references to his wife and the fact that relationship has ended, but if this was the first film, people would probably just accept that as part of his tragic backstory. Like, if you're not going to allow for the existence of backstories that we don't actually see, you wouldn't even be able to enjoy the first film. Who are all these people? How did they meet? What's their relationship to each other? Obviously, we're just supposed to accept all of this stuff is already in place. You could even start watching this series at the fifth film and still not feel like you've missed that much. To the extent that it seems like there is an established relationship between all of the characters, you could just say, well, clearly the characters were originally conceived of in this very well-defined way. But obviously, you can see where I'm going here. Despite the fact that it's not until the next film that we start having films referred to as part of a larger story, this film is obviously very much a continuation of what came before. And it's all because they didn't kill Solomon Lane. They just left him trapped in that plastic box. So of course they couldn't just leave the guy to rot in prison. No, he has to come back as the villain in this film too. I will say though, he looks very cool with the new beard. It kind of gives the impression he's, you know, leveled leveled up as a terrorist. And then he moves to a mountainous region of the Indian subcontinent. I mean, he might as well just start reciting the Shahada at this point. But that might cause some controversy because we find out that the remnants of his followers actually have some extreme anti-religious views.
Dr. Delbrook's security clearance was revoked after he expressed fiercely anti-religious views.
In fact, their first action in this film is to blow up 3 key religious cities: Rome, Jerusalem, and Mecca. So yeah, probably not going to be reciting the Shahada. I think one of them, possibly Lane himself, is described as an anarchist, so this suggests some generically left-wing coded radicals. They hate religion, they hate the government, they hate the existing order of things. There's this guy, Dr. Delbrook, and he basically coordinated these attacks as Lane's most loyal follower while he's in prison. You know, the Sauron to his Morgoth. And he criticizes the IMF for allowing evil to perpetuate, as they are a big part of the current world order and their actions afford it security. This is a very standard criticism of good guys who fight for peace within flawed societies. Batman's a jerk because he violently suppresses street-level crime, but he does nothing to oppose the more insidious systems of exploitation and oppression in the world. You know, we've never seen the IMF investigate financial crimes that destroy the lives of millions of people. This is one of those criticisms that franchises like this like to make of themselves to appear more nuanced, but of course they're never actually going to redress this criticism. I'm not framed right, am I? We just have a character say, hey, you work at the behest of a corrupt system and you don't do anything to actually address that corruption. And it's hard not to be left thinking, that's a good point. Anyway, the genius plan of the Syndicate is to cause so much suffering that people will be united in their shared suffering, and this will lead to world peace. And while this is initially just said by one guy, it seems to be a sentiment that motivates the wider organization throughout the film.
The greater the suffering,
the greater the peace.
Basically, it's the same plan from Watchmen: cause a big disaster that makes everyone come together. Except it's slightly more stupid, because rather than a one-off disaster for which a singular opposition can be blamed as to unite everyone, the plan of the Syndicate is they want to poison the water supply of India and China with smallpox, for which they need a nuke. I don't know if there's a part of my brain that just expects the villain's plan to not really matter, so mentally I just tune it out. But every single time that I've sat down to actually talk about these films, I've suddenly realized I don't actually know what the plan was. All I know is that they definitely say 3 distinct things. Firstly, that the finale is happening at a smallpox containment facility.
Why would Lane target a medical camp?
Smallpox.
What?
Smallpox. The Apostles triggered a smallpox outbreak in Kashmir.
Secondly, that it's going to be involving nuclear weapons because, like, this whole film is about the bad guys trying to acquire some nukes. And thirdly, that somehow by doing this, they will starve 1/3 of the world's population.
Fresh water from the border of China to India and Pakistan. They're going to starve 1/3 of the world's population.
But assuming this plan actually makes sense in terms of all those things coming together, it still doesn't make sense. Because how would creating a famine reduce conflict? When resources are scarce, that's usually the greatest time of conflict. But yeah, the main takeaway here is, logical motivation or not, the villain from the previous film is making a reprisal here. Now obviously where there's reliably been continuity has been in the presence of Luther and Benji. I mean, Benji only since the 3rd film, but since then he's been around for good. Interestingly, entirely missing is Brandt, which is especially weird because he's literally the very last person we see at the end of the previous film, and here he doesn't even get a mention. Now, okay, I can't even be bothered to come up with a good segue here, so here's someone else who's in this film who was in previous films. Ethan's wife. Basically, the film starts off with Ethan dreaming about his wife potentially getting murdered, and then later on when he's pursuing a bad guy, a picture of his wife is shown to him as a bargaining chip. So yeah, bad guys are threatening his wife, and this is a vulnerability. Cool. Interestingly, this isn't like Mission Impossible 3, where the threat to his wife is used to force him to do basically whatever the bad guy wants. Here, instead, she's just put in harm's way in order to put the pressure on him. Like, he arrives at the place where the bomb is about to go off, and he discovers that his wife is working there too as a doctor. But obviously, in in stopping the bomb going off, he's able to save his wife, and that's what he wanted to do anyway. Of course, I keep saying his wife. Her name is Julia, and she has actually moved on. She now has a boyfriend. But the thing is, having moved on or not, the point of Ethan and his wife separating in the first place is that would mean she's no longer in harm's way from bad guys who want to get to Ethan. I did say when I was speaking about the fourth film that this doesn't make sense, because if it's a choice between being an agent and being happy with his wife, he should choose being happy with his wife, and then they can both be safe. Here they actually managed to elaborate on this by saying that initially that's what they tried to do, but eventually they both realized that it was wrong, that their marriage was keeping Ethan from saving people. It's not that he wanted to keep doing his job and that's why he separated from his wife. No, he couldn't handle seeing evil things happening in the world, knowing he could have stopped it. And apparently his wife realized this too, which is why they needed to split up so she would no longer be threatened. So in some sense that fixes everything, because it means that Ethan didn't choose his job over his wife. Obviously that would be a bad thing to do. Instead, they mutually decided together that his job was more important. But in fact, Julia's presence here sort of ruins the whole idea that them separating was for her safety, because, well, she's clearly still in danger. If you wanted this series to make sense, then when he sees his wife at the end of Ghost Protocol should be the last time he sees her. If we continue seeing her after that point, it totally undercuts the idea that he had to split off from her entirely in order to keep her safe. If he keeps seeing her, that shows he hasn't cut her off, and in this film, she certainly isn't safe. Now, at the end of this film, they do have a little conversation where they get some closure and they appear to become more reconciled to the idea of being totally separated from each other. But this film, in existing, robs itself of the closure it's trying to create. Because they were married 3 films ago, and for the previous 2 films, they've been totally separated. And yet still, she was brought back. So this suggests that no matter how long they've been separated for, the bad guys will always seek her out and try to use her as a way to get to Ethan and to exploit his vulnerabilities, because that's exactly what happened in this film. By the way, 12 years after they were first together. So yeah, the return of this character isn't exactly welcome in terms of wider implications for the story, but there is another character returning who I must say is even less welcome. In my review of the previous film, I did not hold back about my disdain for the character of Ilsa Faust. I mean, I don't have any disdain for the character herself, but the use of her as a cheap trick to manufacture intrigue due to her ambiguous loyalty. And I'm sorry to say that here she's not much better. In this film, her entire role is just to be interesting, because who's she really working for? It starts off when she shows up out of nowhere to rescue Ethan in the middle of a mission, so alright, that suggests she's a good guy, right? I mean, she actually helps him several times during this mission. But oh no, wait, there's another moment where Ethan has captured Solomon and he needs him alive, but Ilsa then tries to kill him, so she almost screws up the entire mission. When it's revealed that she's betrayed him again, I was just so annoyed. I was thinking, are they really doing this again? And again, they really lean into this idea that Ethan and Faust are being pushed into taking each other down due to their conflicting loyalties. The woman for whom Ethan's working says that she wants Faust killed because she blames her for screwing up the mission, which, to be fair, she did. She also blames Faust for some murders, which she actually didn't do, but you know what? I hate this character so much, I'm happy for her to be blamed for things she didn't even do. But of course, for Ethan, this is a big issue. He really doesn't want to have to kill this woman who's constantly betrayed him. I'm glad Luther is at least there to always call things how they are.
Ethan, she tried to kill us.
No, not us. Yeah, not us. Lane. She tried to kill Lane. She has no choice.
And she will kill me.
I'm not gonna let that happen.
Ethan, how exactly are you not gonna let that happen?
I just don't understand why Ethan has such a particular fondness for this woman. There's even this whole speech Luther gives about how Ilsa is a vulnerability for Ethan because he worries about her and it preoccupies his mind. They don't string us on too much about Ilsa's true loyalties in this film, at least. Basically, it's the same thing it was in the last film. She's actually working for MI6 and they want Lane killed because, being a former British agent, he knows too much. Which is a fine reason, but nonetheless, that reasoning definitely places her in opposition to Ethan. So at least actually act like your enemies instead of just constantly trusting her even though she's always betraying you. Fortunately, in the end, they do manage to work things out with Faust and she's able to step away from British military intelligence, so going forward, I guess she won't have any dual loyalties. hopefully. Again, to reiterate, my problem is not with the dual loyalty itself, but just the cheapness of it. The fact it doesn't really offer anything beyond the superficial intrigue of, what? She just betrayed them again. I wonder why. It just leaves you constantly asking the same question over and over again, only to keep providing the same answers. But twists aren't always cheap. They can be very interesting. So I want to talk about Henry Cavill. Henry Cavill and his Justice League reshoot ruining mustache. I guess this would be a good time to talk about their first mission together and the fact that Cavill's character, I genuinely can't remember his name, is kind of a jerk. I really want to just keep calling him Henry Cavill, but I guess that's kind of mean because it implies that Henry Cavill isn't a good actor, such that I can only see the actor and not the character he's playing. I just literally have no idea what the character's called, so I guess I have to look it up. Okay, his name is August Walker. I genuinely have no memory of hearing anyone say that name in this entire film, and I feel like it's the kind of name I would remember because it's a very weird name. They probably said it early on when I was too busy looking at his mustache and just thinking, yeah, that would be really difficult to CGI out. Anyway, the point is, despite this being shot at the same time he was playing Superman, he's a very different character in this movie. He's introduced as basically just a tough guy jock who acts first and thinks later.
His reputation precedes.
You use a scalpel. I prefer a hammer.
So in the first mission, they're jumping out of a plane and Ethan is taking his time to explain to August Walker how the oxygen tanks and the parachutes work. But then Walker just jumps out of the plane prematurely, ends up getting struck by lightning and passing out. So then Ethan has to jump down after him and save his life, for which Walker is very unappreciative, just being like, oh thanks, nice one, loser. Then their whole plan is to jump this guy in a nightclub bathroom so that they can make a mask out of his face and wear it to disguise themselves for this meeting that he's supposed to be going to. But basically everything goes wrong in an honestly pretty entertaining way. Firstly, the guy is some kind of Chinese, so obviously he knows martial arts. Come on, that's a rookie error. You never go hand to hand with a Chinese. Then, once they have him sedated in a bathroom stool, a bunch of other guys walk in and think they must be having a gay three-way, which isn't really a massive issue for the mission going well, but it's kind of embarrassing. At least they're in France, so to be honest, over there it's probably weirder for a bunch of guys to not be having a gay three-way. I feel like actually if you walk into a bathroom in France, you're more likely to have some guy walk up to you and go, hey, what are you doing pissing in the anonymous gay sex room? At least save some piss for me. I would like to apologize. I don't really believe that all French men are gay, nor do I believe that all gay men are obsessed with anonymous gay sex and piss play. But yeah, then things get even worse because a woman shows up. That always ruins a fun time. But actually she does screw things up quite a bit because she shoots the guy they were trying to impersonate straight in the face, so obviously they now can't scan his face in order to make a mask. They also have to pretend that Ethan had a violent fight with Walker in order to explain why there's blood everywhere. Speaking of fights, I actually did enjoy the martial arts in this scene, and for some reason I especially liked when Ethan is about to get stabbed with that broken piece of U-bend. I guess it's because it's a very distinct shape, which makes it more interesting when employed as a weapon. Anyway, so without the mask, Ethan just has to pretend to be the buyer while presenting as himself. And this leads to the most interesting thing in this entire film, in my view, and also the most disappointing. See, based on this, Walker comes to a conclusion. Ethan Hunt is the buyer. He's been the bad guy all along. And what would make this so clever as a suggestion is it would mean that Ethan Hunt has set things up so he's able to operate as the villain directly under the government's nose. Because they think that he is operating undercover and he has to present himself as himself because the mask making didn't work. A bad guy literally just being the bad guy with government approval because they think he's a good guy undercover. That would be a clever twist. That would be a much better twist than the constant barrage of unpredictable betrayals from Faust. It would be a clever twist because you don't see it coming, but it makes a lot of sense when viewed in retrospect, and it actually requires good writing. Like Walker says, Hunt has plenty of reasons to dislike the IMF, considering just how many times he's been disavowed and disowned and otherwise betrayed.
How many times has Hunt's government betrayed him, disavowed him, cast him aside, and how long before a man like that has had enough?
The awesome thing about it is that it would mean that just as Ethan Hunt is operating as the bad guy directly under the government's nose, he's also doing it in plain sight right in front of us. Like, we're literally watching Ethan Hunt actively go out of his way to buy nuclear weapons from evil arms traders, and we're perfectly willing to accept that he's doing that because, hey, he's just maintaining his cover.
Would you draw the line at killing cops?
That's John Lark you're talking to.
I murder women and children with smallpox. I have no line.
That's such a clever twist, and there's even something slightly meta about it. We as the audience are being tricked, just as everyone else is. So we see him doing all these evil things in the film. By the way, the woman he's working for is this kind of underdeveloped character who poses as a philanthropist but is actually an arms dealer. But the thing is, actually she's just a middleman, and the true buyer does want to trade the weapons to Ethan, but only in exchange for him helping Solomon Lane out of police custody. But in order to do this, they would have to kill a whole load of French policemen, and we get this little slow motion scene where we see what it would look like for Ethan to just stand there as a load of people are killed. And this is where we have to confront the fundamental problem with this twist. It doesn't work because it's Ethan Hunt. Ethan Hunt would have to be the bad guy for this twist to work, and he's not the bad guy. Ethan Hunt is never going to be the bad guy, and we wouldn't want him to be because one of the points of this franchise is that he's the hero. So instead he comes up with this different plan where he just pushes the prison truck into the river, and then Benji and Luther come along and they're able to abduct Lane underwater. Meanwhile, all the policemen are able to swim away, and Ethan even does some sharp turns in the truck that he's driving, whereby he knocks out the other bad guys and just leaves them for the police to pick them up and arrest them. So they're able to abduct Lane without participating in anything evil, or indeed killing the law enforcement of an allied sovereign nation. Now would be a good time to remember that these films do have to be commercially viable, so showing your hero killing a foreign country's police force wouldn't be a good idea. Like, even when they do get discovered by this French policeman, and it seems like they might have to shoot her in order to get away with it, a bad guy shows up at the last minute and shoots her instead. And even then she's alive, so all is well. I will just give some brief praise to this broader scene. Ethan escaping from the police is very entertaining. My favourite moment is when he gets hit by a car and he's desperately scrambling away, and he makes it to a manhole cover where he's able to burn through it and fall into a boat underneath him. It's a bit contrived, but it makes a decent amount of sense. We already know that Benji and Luther are on a boat, so it would make sense that they would send him coordinates to somewhere where he could go that they could intercept him. So he's already on his way there, and then when he gets knocked off his bike, he can just limp the last few steps. I guess what I like is when escapes are unexpected, but not unbelievable. But my big issue is that because Ethan is still clearly a good guy, it means the film fails to deliver on the intrigue of a rogue agent pretending to be undercover in order to act as a villain in plain sight. This is just something that Walker speculates, but we don't actually see it in practice. And that's not a good sign, really, when the most interesting thing in your film is something someone mentions as a possibility, but doesn't actually end up happening. And even Walker knew it wasn't actually going to happen because he knows that Ethan isn't the traitor, because he's the traitor. The next scene is actually really dense in that it brings a lot of stuff together, but uncharacteristically, it's not that confusing and it's pretty easy to understand what's going on. So obviously, Lane knows Ethan. So the plan is to put a bag over his head so he won't be able to see anything. But in all the excitement of the chase, the bag ends up coming off his head and he does see Ethan. And now, if he brings him to the exchange, Lane's just going to blow his cover. So the plan is to disguise Benji as Lane with a mask and bring him to the meeting, and leave the real Lane with Walker. But after they're gone, Walker starts talking to Lane and reveals that he is the traitor. But it turns out they did a switcheroo, and the Lane they left behind was actually Benji in the mask. And also the secretary was there the whole time listening, so really they didn't actually need Benji to be in a mask because they just had someone listening to what he was saying anyway. Also, speaking of listening, I believe we now get our first F word in the series.
Why'd you have to make this so fucking complicated?
After this, the head of the CIA, of course, condemns Walker, and we also find out that the middleman, or middlewoman, who was arranging the weapons exchange, was working for the CIA all along. You could argue this is the same cheap mask trick we've seen many times before, and in some sense, it sort of is. But I think because we knew that Benji was going to be wearing a mask anyway, it's not a twist that he was wearing a mask, but rather that they were able to do this switcheroo where Walker didn't realize who he was actually talking to, and that's a much more earned twist. Like, this isn't the same same vibe as the first few films, where someone could just be talking to a random person and at any given moment it could suddenly be revealed that they were someone else the whole time. Now, after all this, the CIA end up screwing everything up anyway because they tried to take the IMF in based on how poorly they've handled the mission so far. I mean, to be fair, they have given the Syndicate way too many nukes in this film at this point, especially considering that their initial mission was to stop the Syndicate getting nukes by any means possible.
Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to prevent the Apostles from acquiring plutonium using any means at your disposal.
But yeah, then it turns out that some of the CIA agents who showed up to arrest them are actually also bad guys. So there's a shootout, and in the confusion, Walker runs away. The next scene is pretty entertaining. Ethan runs away from all of the bad agents by going into a church, and that looks pretty. There are also, in this chase scene, a few jumps from one building to another, which I would assume were real-life stunts that Tom Cruise did. There's a funny joke where Benji is directing Ethan in his pursuit of Walker, who, by the way, is not actually getting away that fast. I guess they don't call him Walker for nothing. But yeah, the funny joke is that Benji's like, come on Ethan, you're right on top of him, hurry up. But in reality, Ethan is running across the rooftops while Walker is at ground level, and then Benji's like, whoops, sorry, I had it in 2D. There is a bit of luck where Walker is in a perfect position to shoot Ethan dead, and he doesn't, apparently because they need something from him. But then I don't think they ever actually explain what it is they need from him that means that Walker shouldn't just kill him now. Now, like I say, I really love this idea of a twist where it turns out that the undercover agent is actually not going undercover at all, but is instead a bona fide bad guy. The problem is it doesn't really make sense that Walker is the one suggesting this about Ethan, because obviously Ethan isn't going to be the bad guy. So the solution here is really simple. If you already know that Walker is going to be the bad guy, why don't you make him be the one who's going undercover and have it be revealed that he is only going undercover as an excuse to continue being a villain in plain sight? You came up with this really interesting twist, and then you didn't think to actually apply it to the person for whom it could actually function as a twist. And by the way, a good way to actually make it a twist would be to have Walker be slightly sympathetic at the beginning. As I communicated, he's kind of a jerk, and the jerk being the person who was a villain all along is pretty predictable. But what if he was a good guy who seemed to have some genuine investment in the mission, maybe some sort of sympathetic backstory? So when he goes undercover because he has to, because they don't have the mask machine, and then he starts doing evil things, we'd be like, oh wow, he's really committed to maintaining his cover story to make sure he takes down these bad guys. And if that's the assumption that the film leads us to make, and I think many people would be willing to make that assumption considering how often people do sincerely go undercover in these films, it would be so much more of a dramatic twist if we then find out that actually he was the bad guy all along. Like they say in this film, he was operating in plain sight as the villain by pretending to be a good guy undercover. But instead they just have this be something that Walker makes up about Ethan to deflect from himself, and I'm sorry, but that is a much more boring way to introduce this potential twist. Anyway, so I guess I'll just finish up with the whole Walker vs. Hunt drama. In the final action scene, Walker is escaping in a helicopter and Ethan needs to intercept him. So first of all, he climbs a rope in order to get onto a separate helicopter, and of course while he's climbing, he has a moment where he loses his grip and he almost falls and he grabs on at the last minute. Gotta have something like that, probably a real stunt. Then they have this helicopter chase, which is pretty entertaining, and eventually they end up crashing into each other. What I like even more is that basically the helicopters end up getting wedged in this crack in the mountain, and they're kind of fighting each other while the helicopters are sideways and they're slowly falling down, so they're kind of fighting in these awkward positions while the helicopters are moving around them. It's just a really dynamic fight, which I guess you can probably tell by the way I'm describing it and the visuals I'm probably putting on screen now. Then they have another fight once they're outside the helicopters. Walker ends up dying, Ethan survives, happy ending. And then at the end they wrap up the wider CIA vs IMF drama by having the head of the CIA show some special appreciation for what IMF does. And specifically we're told it's good that Ethan isn't willing to trade lives. He refuses to give up one life to save many. It's worth noting the IMF has said explicitly before that they have a policy of disavowing any agent that gets captured. So the idea that the IMF has this uniquely sacrosanct view of an individual human life doesn't seem entirely accurate. Like, the nature of the name Impossible Mission Force implies that the missions must be very difficult, such that it's not expected that most agents will actually survive, so they've sort of got to be viewed as expendable. Also, I don't know why I'm only saying this now, but I can't hold back any longer on the observation that the Impossible Mission Force is abbreviated to the IMF. But there's also another real-world IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, and both of these organizations are involved in global politics. So if I say that the IMF is undermining democracy, what am I talking about? Is Ethan Hunt going on a covert mission where he's going to assassinate the next Allende? Or is this just the International Monetary Fund imposing obligations on a sovereign country that is in debt to impose neoliberal policies against the wishes of the population? I guess the good news is actually in this film series so far, Ethan hasn't done a mission where he's assassinated the leader of a sovereign country. So if I ever do need to distinguish them, I'll just refer to the Impossible Mission Force as the non-evil IMF. I must admit, I was prejudiced against this movie right from the start, because I always feel like once a series has an established typical runtime for a film, you should make an effort to stick within that. For these films so far, it's been 2 hours, but in this case, out of nowhere, it's suddenly 2.5 hours. And as such, the whole film has this meandering pace to it. Like, there isn't actually that much that happens in this film. I don't think I'll have spent that much longer in talking about it than I have for the others. It takes us 16 minutes just to get to the opening titles. See, we start off with Ethan Hunt trying to buy some plutonium in order to stop the syndicate from getting it. By the way, it is hilarious to me that most of this film is just the IMF trying to buy plutonium in order to stop the syndicate getting it. Which leaves me thinking, was their ultimate plan just to buy all of the plutonium in the world? Do they have the budget for that? Fortunately, they actually never end up spending any money because Luther, who was supposed to be bringing the money, gets ambushed by the syndicate. So then everyone thinks that everyone's betrayed everyone else and there's a big shootout. There's a really cool moment where Benji uses a remote control car that Ethan is able to get in order to access the plutonium. But then, of course, Luther has still been captured, so eventually Ethan's told, hey, give us the plutonium or else we'll kill your friend. Fortunately, Luther is wearing body armor, so Ethan's just able to shoot at the guy a couple of times, and even though a few of the shots hit Luther, it doesn't matter because he's got armor on. So, problem solved, right? Except no, because when Ethan goes to rescue Luther, he loses the plutonium because he left it unattended just round the corner. That just seems like such a rookie error, but it's also really comedic to me that it was stolen because he just left it round the corner. You really can't be too careful with these things. My dad's not a very trusting person, so whenever we went to the beach as a family, there was a policy that not everyone was allowed to go into the sea at the same time. Someone had to stay on the beach. Someone had to stay with the bags. Because, you know, someone might come along right in the middle of a crowded beach and steal our ham sandwiches and salt and vinegar crisps. It was probably overly cautious, but to this day, I still feel uneasy leaving my bags unattended on the beach and going to swim in the sea. So the idea of a secret agent leaving weaponized plutonium unattended and some sneaky guy stealing it as soon as he's out of sight round the corner is so funny to me. Anyway, so that was a long scene, and then after that, they interview that one doctor, Dr. Debrook, to try and get some info out of him. The scene is actually pretty clever. Basically, he wakes up in his hospital room and there's a news channel on the TV, and he thinks that he's achieving something by getting them to read his manifesto on the news in exchange for some codes. But then it turns out that actually, the hospital room was fake, and the newsreel was fake, and the newscaster was just Benji wearing a mask. Benji gets to wear a lot of masks in this film, which is quite nice because in the previous films, he was always talking about wanting to wear a mask, and it always worked out that he was never actually able to. I actually wrote down in my notes, Luther's acting is either really bad or they're faking something.
Think, Ethan. Think of the greater good, please.
I'm glad to reveal, of course, that this scene was fake, and therefore Luther was faking something, and that's why he sounds awkward, and therefore Ving Rhames can maintain his position as the #1 actor of all time. Anyway, so here's the thing. It isn't until after all of this stuff has happened that we then get the title credits. Isn't that insane? And the slow-paced nature of this film continues right until the very end in a kind of hilarious way. We're told that they can't defuse the bombs until the countdown starts, which sounds like it would create some really intense pressure.
In order to make this work, we can't remove the key or cut the fuses until after the countdown starts.
Wait, just so I've got this clear. Our only chance to safely defuse both bombs is to let the countdown start.
But in reality, the countdown starts almost as soon as they get there, so they wouldn't have been able to defuse it beforehand anyway, and the countdown is 15 minutes. Now, obviously stuff happens during that 15 minutes, which means it still ultimately ends up coming right down to the wire. The entire helicopter chase happens during this time. But it's just so funny to me to make a big deal about the countdown and the fact that they actually have to wait until the countdown started before they can begin defusing it. And then it's not like a 10-second countdown or something, it's 15 minutes. And while the helicopter chase is exciting, most of Benji and Faust's plot is just them walking around the camp looking for the bombs. Like, all they're doing is walking from room to room to see where they are. Are they here? Nope. Are they here? Nope. Oh, there they are. And because this is intercut with the helicopter chase, it just drives home how unexciting this is by comparison. It does get more exciting when Faust fights Lane, although he ends up defeating her, and he has time to tie her up, which seems like it would take at least a few minutes. But after that, he still ends up having a whole fight with Benji, and then Faust breaks free, so he has a fight with her, and she kills him, so at least he's gone for good now. And somehow, after all of that, they still have 4 minutes left. There is at least a bit of complexity with defusing the bombs after they found them. Each device is connected to 2 bombs, which means that if you cut the wire to one of the bombs, that will trigger the other one to go off, which adds a lot of tension. There is one thing that annoys me though, which is that Benji talks about how these bombs will explode if anything goes wrong, and he calls this a failsafe.
The countdown is started via a remote detonator, which is also a failsafe. Meaning once the countdown starts, it can't be stopped.
But that's literally the opposite to a failsafe. A failsafe describes a device where if something goes wrong, it will shut down so that nobody gets hurt. It's a failsafe. If it fails, it's still safe. Terrorists tend to design their bombs without a failsafe, so that if something goes wrong, it will still explode anyway and kill lots of people. That's called a fail deadly. Just think about the literal meaning of the words failsafe and then realize Benji is describing a device that, if it fails, will cause a nuclear explosion. How is that safe? Despite the slow pacing for this film, the defusing of the bomb does actually manage to come down to the very last second. Literally the last second. With 1 second to go, they defuse the bomb. There's actually a great bit of editing where it looks like Ethan could be looking at a nuclear explosion because they failed, but then we see he's just looking at the sunset. Overall, you maybe can already tell that I have quite mixed feelings about this one. There are a lot of positives, but also a lot of negatives. For the record, the slow pacing itself isn't a negative. I actually quite like slow-paced movies. It just annoys me that means this film stands out compared to the precedent set by the previous films. I like uniformity. My biggest issue would probably be that a lot of characters are brought back who I don't find particularly interesting, although at least most of them are actually handled better in this film. And the big positive is probably that the idea of Ethan being an undercover agent who's secretly rogue all along is a really great idea for a twist. But again, that's kind of actually, at the same time, the huge problem. That this idea isn't actually presented in the film itself, it's just mentioned. I did find the action more exciting here compared to the previous 2 films. In fact, I'm pretty confident in saying that this film overall is better than Rogue Nation, but I don't think it's as good as Mission Impossible 3. The question is, where should I place it between the middling 6 I gave Rogue Nation and the middling 7 I gave 3? It's interesting, I took a little break in the middle of making this review to do some other stuff, and I ended up watching some different movies in the meantime. One of which was the movie Eraser starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. And it was an interesting benchmark to have watched, because it is of course just a very generic action movie, and I was sat there thinking, how should I rate it? Overall, as a movie, how good is it? It was a competent movie, it had some entertaining moments, but the characters weren't very interesting, and it was overall pretty generic. I ended up giving it a high 5. And I was thinking, is that kind of harsh? And I ended up justifying it by thinking, well, at the end of the day, isn't an action movie being entertaining kind of the minimum standard? And in that case, yeah, this movie is entertaining, but how much above the minimum standard does that actually elevate it? I think I can only give this a high 6, but that does mean that we're heading in a positive direction, so presumably the next film will be a low 7, and that way we're on a trajectory to finish on a high note with the 8th one. Yay! There are a few words which I think are really useful, but they're limited by the fact that a lot of people don't know what they mean. Epistemology is a good example. It's useful to have a word to describe how we come to know the truth. Problem is, you can't actually use that word in most conversations because a lot of people people aren't familiar with it, and therefore if you use it, they'll just think you're trying to sound smart. At least with the word McGuffin, people probably aren't going to think you're trying to sound smart by saying it, but still, it's a word I very rarely use because I just imagine most people wouldn't know what I was talking about. And that's annoying because it's a really useful word for which there's no immediate substitute, and when you're talking about films, it gets at something quite important. A MacGuffin basically just describes the object that the characters want. So yeah, obviously if you're talking about a plot, that's very relevant. In Harry Potter, it's the Philosopher's Stone and the Horcruxes and the Deathly Hallows. These important things where the plot is different characters trying to get them. In Lord of the Rings, it's the One Ring. You couldn't hope to describe the plot of that trilogy without talking about the significance of the actual thing that everyone is fighting over. And basically every single Mission Impossible film has some sort of MacGuffin. The list of covert agents' names, the Chimera virus, the rabbit's foot, the nuclear launch codes, the bank account details for the syndicate, and for Fallout it was all about getting nuclear weapons. Now the thing is, for the most part, what these MacGuffins actually are doesn't really matter. In fact, a more narrow definition of MacGuffin would dictate that the specifics of the object are irrelevant. It might even be a way of insulting the writing. This central object doesn't matter and it isn't very interesting. It's just a pointless thing for the characters to be fighting over to manufacture conflict. It's a MacGuffin. Now I wouldn't use it as an insult at all, even when sticking to that narrow definition. Because of course my favourite film in this series so far would be Mission Impossible 3, where we're basically told nothing about the rabbit's foot. But I actually praise that for a variety of reasons, both on a meta level in that it shows how secretive this thing is, but most of all because Mission Impossible 3 is such a successful character-driven film that it doesn't matter what the rabbit's foot actually is. All that matters is who's trying to get it. Now, you can probably tell by everything I've said so far that I actually do want to talk about the MacGuffin in this movie, mostly because in this film, what it actually is quite significant. In part because it kind of gets at a lot of hot button issues in the world right now. I mean, this film literally starts off on a Russian sub named after a city in Crimea, so you might be thinking this film is going to be very much about current events. I personally wouldn't want these films to try and relate themselves directly to current geopolitics, so I'm glad they actually don't do that. In reality, the Russians aren't the bad guys at all, and they actually end up being the first victims of this device, which is called the Entity, by the way. Basically, it's an artificial intelligence, so yeah, very relevant to current events, even if not geopolitics. It can create false images on security footage, it can spread fake news on social media, it can impersonate people's voices, and what ultimately got the Russians is that it can trick a submarine's radar. Being artificially intelligent, it's not just a device, but in some sense a character. It is both MacGuffin and villain. With that said, it doesn't have that much of a character. One of my favourite moments for the Entity is when Ethan is attending this rave, and then suddenly it's revealed that the Entity is actually controlling all of the lights and all of the music in this room, and that's the moment where this entity, which is otherwise quite abstract, feels like a genuine presence in the room.
Is this
the Entity?
And so the plot thickens.
But it doesn't have that much of a personality beyond being generically evil, and there's the suggestion that it doesn't really have much personal agency. Like, the sense in which it's more of a MacGuffin than a character in itself is that a lot of the human characters in this movie want to take control of it. The fact that they might be able to take control of it would suggest that this AI doesn't have agency such that it's totally independent of human control, or maybe this is just the humans dramatically underestimating it. Because in fact the other interesting aspect to this device is that it can, to an extent, control human behavior. Like I said, it was cool when we got a sense of the Entity being this real presence during the nightclub scene. But the other way in which it could affect the real world is that it knows a lot of people's online history and their messages and stuff like that. So it has the ability to blackmail them. In theory, if it could find a human being with some really serious secrets, it would be able to get that person to do whatever it wants. What's weird is that this idea is introduced, but then for the rest of the film, we never actually see the computer use what could be a genuine superpower. I mean, the Entity could do a lot of damage simply based on the fact that it would know some really powerful people's deepest, darkest secrets, and it just decides, not to bother doing anything with that. Like, there's this suspicious guy early on at this really important meeting, and the film is clearly wanting you to assume that this is a guy who has been blackmailed by the computer into doing its bidding. But then it turns out actually it was just Ethan Hunt wearing a mask, and that's why he was acting kind of suspicious. Something else established in this very important meeting is that the government is also kind of suspect in a lot of this. They literally say that they supported the entity when it was manipulating the news because often that aligned with their purposes. Oh, also in this scene they explicitly mention the International Monetary Fund. Isn't that weird that they would mention that just after I mentioned it in my review of the previous film?
The IMF, Mr. Kittredge.
The World Bank.
No, that's the International Monetary Fund.
Mr. Kittredge.
No, I mean the other IMF.
And also in this scene we get reintroduced to Kittredge, who I believe hasn't made an appearance since the very first film. So the McGuffin is a villain in itself in that it has a personality, but also we have some officials in the US government who are also kind of behaving like villains. Like there's this one dude who's pretty high up, I think he's the Secretary of Defense, and towards the end of the film we find out that actually the US government are the ones who created the entity, and this guy's ultimate plan is to create a global superpower by combining the hyper-intelligence of the entity with the military might of the United States. Also, everyone's pursuing this key, which is the real MacGuffin because it gives you the ability to control the entity, and a large part of the plot is that the IMF are trying to stop this bad guy from purchasing the key. But it turns out actually the person buying the key was Kittredge. What a twist. To be honest though, it wasn't clear to me exactly how evil we were supposed to understand this action to be. Like I couldn't tell if this was just a case of Kittredge wanting to purchase it himself to keep it out of the wrong hands, or if he himself had an evil plan here. The way he's treated after this moment suggests that we're supposed to understand these actions as roguish, but not necessarily villainous. The Secretary of Defense on the other hand is unambiguously a villain, but he just gets killed literally seconds after we find out this is the case, which makes his whole presence kind of pointless. This film also has the obligatory law enforcement people who think that Ethan is the villain because he's going rogue, but they don't actually have any sort of personal vendetta against him, nor are they assuming a villainous role themselves, but instead mostly just acting as inconveniences. But the thing is, it actually takes a massive amount of time for the genuine villain of this film to appear, like the actual villain, the analogue to the main villains in the previous films. See, basically quite a while into the film, they're at this airport. I can't really remember why, but I think it's just to intercept somebody. And Benji ends up discovering that there's this nuclear weapon inside of a bag. Again, I can't really remember why he's looking through a particular bag, but it ends up, in order to defuse it, he has to play a game of riddles with the computer, where the answers to each riddle give a clue to the password that will defuse the bomb. This is actually a clever idea for a challenge that the heroes must face, and the computer comes across as a quite compelling villain in this moment. What's weird though is that, well, firstly, that must mean that this computer has an incredibly sophisticated artificial intelligence if it's literally deriving enjoyment out of playing games with people. That suggests full-on emotions. But secondly, what's weird is that Benji starts freaking out about the fact that the computer stops giving him prompts when he's only got one letter left in the password.
I've got no more questions and there's one more wheel. How am I supposed to give answers if I've got no questions?
That must be your final test.
I've got 45 seconds!
But the thing is, at this point he literally could just try every single possible combination because he's only got one more letter to put in. But the thing is, okay, so while all of this is going on, there is another villain, and he's called Gabriel, and I honestly think he is an incredibly underwhelming villain. Like, I think he's probably the worst villain of this entire series. Like, firstly, okay, it turns out that this whole time he was walking around the airport and the security wasn't picking him up because the entity was erasing his face from all of the security footage. So that's like the computer protecting him. And doesn't that make him seem kind of lame that he's reliant on the computer to keep him safe? So he's not very powerful then, right? Like, if the computer just decided to stop protecting him, he would get caught really quickly. Surely a good villain should actually have a sense of being in control of things rather than just a lackey to somebody else. He's more of a henchman than a villain. The closest thing we get to motivation from Gabriel is this line about how he sees death as a gift that he can give people.
He's a dark messiah, the entity's chosen messenger. And he sees death as a gift he wants to share with the rest of the world.
The thing is, that's just obviously such a generic, meaningless thing for a bad guy to say that it ultimately communicates no sincere sentiment. Like, at least the Syndicate and the bad guy from Ghost Protocol had a clear idea of what they thought these deaths would achieve. This guy's just like, yeah, I want to kill everyone because I feel like it. Which could work if he was supposed to be this terrifying force of nature, but he's literally the opposite of that. He's subservient to a machine. So because this guy is the most boring villain of all time, they tried to make him a little bit interesting by giving him this backstory where he murdered a loved one of Ethan 30 years ago before he was in the IMF. And I don't like this idea at all. I think Ethan is more interesting when he doesn't have a backstory. He isn't well served by a needless origin. And retconning it so he has this formative history with this guy who is otherwise the most forgettable villain of all time isn't a good look. But I guess there's supposed to be some sort of emotional stakes based on this for Ethan, so he enters into the final confrontation with Luther telling him it's absolutely vital that he doesn't kill Gabriel because they've got some information they need from him. In the end, they just end up having a bit of a fight. It's the most generic Mission Impossible fight you could imagine. Actually, it takes place on top of a train, which is a fun throwback to the first one. In the end, this incredibly unimpressive villain closes this film by getting totally dunked on because he thinks he's got away with the key, and then he realizes that Ethan just pickpocketed him. And then this happens. Is it just me, or is that really dumb? Like, it comes across as almost comedic? Genuinely a really strong contender for the worst villain so far. I mean, Hendrix from Ghost Protocol was bad, but that's just because there wasn't very much of him. This guy has a lot more to him, but a lot of that is actively bad. His motivation has no substance to it whatsoever. He isn't intimidating or powerful and is in fact subservient to someone else. The backstory of him and Ethan having history feels manufactured and forced. And speaking of forced, his acting isn't that great either. In fact, if I was to rank the villains, I'd probably say Davian in the top spot, obviously. Then, unironically, Ambrose from the second one is genuinely the second best villain. Then Jim Phelps from the first one. So yeah, the first three villains are the ones who make the podium in my estimation. And then Solomon Lane is fourth, Hendrix is fifth, and this guy ranks dead last. I mean, again, I'll remind you, they don't actually introduce this guy until like an hour in. That's how little confidence they had that he would actually be compelling. And speaking of characters I don't like, let's talk about Ilsa. So in the last film, I said it looked like she had finally escaped all of her conflicting obligations and now she was free to be much less of an annoyance. I don't know why I have any confidence in this series. Why do I keep letting them subject me to this nonsense? Because guess what? The first time she's mentioned in this film, it's because there was a courier that the IMF wanted to intercept and Ilsa killed him.
He killed a courier in Istanbul, and we believe he was carrying one half of the key we're searching for. Why she has chosen to interfere in this affair is a mystery.
Maybe I'm alone in this. Maybe other people like this character. My position is that it's really boring to have a character who just constantly betrays people and we're supposed to be mystified by why this is happening. As if we're supposed to be interested in this. Why did she betray the side she was working for? Who cares? And the other thing is, they keep up with this idea that despite this woman constantly working against Ethan, he's still really emotionally invested in her well-being. So the first mission is that he has to go rescue Faust because a whole load of assassins are after her, presumably because she constantly betrays people, so now he has to go bail her out. As a Christian, I endorse the message of the prodigal son. But realistically, if we're being honest, there's a point at which if someone has constantly betrayed you, and then you find out that they're in trouble for having constantly betrayed everyone else, I could excuse anyone for just saying, well, she's made her bed, now it's time for her to lie in it.
That's the pattern, isn't it? You get her out of trouble and she always found her way back in.
The scene of Ethan rescuing her is kind of cool because it's like visually interesting that there's a sandstorm going on, but the real positive is that she seems to finally be dead. Except later we find out she's not. Boo! I'm booing you. Have I mentioned yet that it takes half an hour for us to get to the opening titles? Half an hour! Everything I just described happened within the first half an hour of the film before we get the title card. When we're introduced to Faust alive now, we do actually get a somewhat reasonable explanation for her betrayal this time. Turns out she thought she was getting orders from somebody else, but actually it was the entity misdirecting her to do something more evil, which I guess is an okay excuse. After this we get the scene which I really didn't like. They go to another weird rave in an old European city, which is exactly what they did in the previous film, but this time time it's not Paris, it's Venice. And basically it's Ethan there with 3 women, all of whom are of ambiguous loyalty, which is great. I love me some ambiguous loyalty. That's always intrinsically interesting. There's Alana, who's the weapons dealer from the last film. There's Grace, who I'll talk about later. And then there's Ilsa Faust. There's also Gabriel there, desperately trying to be interesting as he goes off on a sad little rant. And then there's this moment where Ethan's like, hey, you know, I could totally just take down Gabriel right now, but he needs Alana's permission to do it because she's sort of in control of this whole situation. But Alana decides to let Gabriel go and screw Ethan over. Now, first of all, this bothers me because I can't believe that Alana wouldn't be able to see that Gabriel is obviously a far less trustworthy guy than Ethan. I mean, it's literally in this very scene that he gives his whole "death is a gift" speech. I'd assume that Alana, working in the field she does, would be a reasonably good judge of character. And it absolutely is in her interest here to cooperate with Ethan, but instead, she screws him over to help out this guy. And the other issue here is that Gabriel, again, looks really weak here because he's not in control of this situation at all. If Alana just decided to be logical and said, actually, yeah, you know what, I'm going to have my security seize this guy and we'll make a deal with the IMF where I hand him over in exchange for something in return, which would be a perfectly reasonable thing for her to do, then seemingly Gabriel would be totally screwed. So again, this guy who's supposed to be this powerful villain is actually totally dependent on the goodwill of other people and is never in control of the situation himself. After this, there's a big fight where a whole lot of different conflicting parties are coming together and clashing. It's all very hectic. And to add to the confusion, this is also where the entity hijacks Benji's computer and starts giving misleading commands to Ethan. And in the middle of all this, Faust and Gabriel are having a fight. It's presented as if this is this really climactic fight with this intense music, but it's literally happening halfway through the film between 2 characters we don't care about. Like, can you imagine how bored and unmoved I must have been as I realized this film was really trying to sell me on the intensity and importance of this fight between my 2 least favorite characters? Fortunately, Ilsa gets stabbed, and this time she stays dead. I can't pretend I'm disappointed. And I guess this furthers Ethan's beef with Gabriel because, again, he for some reason really cared about Ilsa Faust. So his 2 big objections are that Gabriel killed a woman 30 years ago whom we've never heard of before, and that he just recently killed a woman who has done nothing but betray Ethan the whole time. That's a real animus for vengeance right there. Anyway, let's end this with a compliment because this is not a bad movie, it's just that its 2 weakest aspects happen to be these 2 very important characters who stand out. But there is this other woman called Grace, who's a thief, and Ethan needs to recruit her because of her useful thief skills. Hey, that's the exact same plot as the second film. This woman is a little bit more annoying than Naya though, but only mildly so. Firstly, she's very resistant to getting recruited in the first place, so Ethan has to cool the place where she's fleeing to so that she gets arrested, and then he gets to come in and save her as the only person able to help her out. I'm not saying it's completely ridiculous for her to be suspicious of him, but it gets to a point where everyone's chasing at her and shooting at her and clearly trying to kill her, and Ethan's the only one who is pretty obviously trying to help her out. And it's always just a little bit frustrating when the hero is trying to help someone and they're actively resisting it. Fortunately, she does eventually realize she's best off with him, and the subsequent car chase that happens is actually like a highlight of the movie. Because Ethan doesn't fully trust her, he handcuffs her to him, but in such a way that she would have to be the one sitting in the driver's seat. And she's really bad at driving, which is funny to watch. And then when eventually Ethan's like, all right, we need to switch places, he kind of has to drive with his arms crossed over each other. So there's actually a lot of good jokes here. I like how they keep knocking over Vespers, although actually the last time that I was in Italy, this guy was complaining to me that in northern Italy they don't really have Vespers, that's more of a southern thing. So whenever there's a northern town in a movie and there are Vespers everywhere, that's like racist because it's assuming all of Italy is the same. I like when you think their car is going to be this really fancy sports car and then it's actually this really tiny car that's not very nice looking at all. I like when the car falls down the stairs and in the commotion they somehow end up switching seats and they're obviously really confused about that. Yeah, it's a good scene in terms of action, definitely. Now, she's still a bit annoying for Ethan because even after all that, she then decides to handcuff him to the steering wheel of the car when it's come to a stop on a train track. At least it leads to a very intense moment where he's hurriedly having to pick the lock as a train is just about to hit him. But yeah, she could have killed him here. But I don't know, it's easier to buy that she's just doing this because she was confused at this point because all of this is new to her, compared to Faust, who had been doing this for years and was still just betraying people knowing full well exactly what she was doing. Once Grace actually understands what's going on, she warms up to the IMF, and we even get to see a scene of what it actually looks like when someone is recruited into the IMF itself. And we find out that apparently everyone joins the IMF based on having at some point been in legal trouble.
Your future boils down to 3 options now.
Prison? Death?
Or the choice?
The choice.
At one time or another, each of us was in a similar situation to yours.
And each of us was offered the choice.
Which I'm not sure if an organization of entirely criminals who only join for self-preservation would be a great foundation for a covert secret agency, but I guess you can't argue with results. Again, there's another issue where the mask machine breaks. Those really are unreliable. But there was time for Grace's mask to be completed so she could disguise herself as Alana, but that would mean that she'd have to be the only one infiltrating this mission as a very new agent. Meanwhile, Ethan's plan is to ride a motorbike in order to intercept the train while it's in motion so that he can take the key off of Grace once she's ready. That's a pretty cool idea, jumping onto a train from a motorbike. But then Gabriel, remember him, happens to decide to hijack the train and jam its accelerator into the fastest position, and this means that the train doesn't slow down, so Ethan isn't able to get on it. What's weird is that nobody seems to notice the train speeding up, so I guess the top speed for trains isn't actually very high, even when the accelerator is jammed into the maximum possible speed. But then, because Ethan can't get on the train, this leads to an even more awesome moment, where in order to intercept it further down the line, he has to ride the motorbike up a mountain and ramp off the edge of a cliff, jumping off the cliff on his motorbike, and then parachuting onto the train. Meanwhile, for Grace on the train, things get a bit complicated because first of all, this is where we find out that Kettridge is some sort of bad guy. The way it's introduced is actually pretty nice because basically when they're explaining how you join the IMF, Ethan's like, well, you have to meet this guy called Kettridge and he's really important and very high up in the organization. So that means that she already knows who he is when she meets him, which puts her in a really awkward, confusing situation where she's having to infiltrate this meeting under disguise, talking to someone who she thought is supposed to be a good guy. Although again, like I said, I'm not sure if he's supposed to be understood as a bad guy. I think he's maybe just a good guy who's going a bit rogue in order to acquire this dangerous device. And the thing is, all Grace ends up saying in this situation is, alright, we'll make the deal, but I want you to guarantee the safety of this woman called Grace. Which I'd think would be suspicious to a guy who thinks he's meeting Alana, but is now being told that to her, it's really important that this random woman called Grace is taken care of. And I'm not even sure why she does this, because if her plan is to join the IMF anyway, then surely she'll get whatever safety Kettridge could offer once the mission is complete no matter what. It just kind of seems to me like they thought it would be a cool twist if we suddenly find out Kettridge is the buyer, but then they weren't actually sure where to take that, so they just had a load of random things happen. After this, Grace gets discovered when the real Alana shows up, but fortunately she is saved by Ethan smashing through the window in his parachute and knocking out the bad guys. It turns out that Gabriel's plan is to blow up this bridge so that the train plummets and explodes, and this leads to a really good scene, even if it is a bit derivative of Jurassic Park 2. Basically, they have to climb through the train carriages as each carriage falls one by one. It is a bit ridiculous just how often the carriages snap and fall down just as they're making it off of that carriage onto the next one. But if you can ignore the convenience of that timing, it certainly makes for an exhilarating time. The best bit is when there's a grand piano strapped down above them and they're hanging on to some furniture beneath it. So they have to jump from one side of the train to the other, and just as they do it, the piano comes crashing down, destroying everything beneath it. And because that whole thing meant they spent much longer in that carriage than they did for any of the others, conveniently, that carriage just so happens to take much longer to snap off than all the other ones did. And even more conveniently, they're about to fall when Gabriel's sidekick switches sides and rescues them. Can we talk about the weird habit of this film portraying all women as disloyal for a minute? Like, this is way too consistent of a trend for it to be a coincidence. There are 4 women who play significant roles in this film, and every single one of them at some point betrays whichever side they're working for. And let's not forget that Claire, who was the first prominent woman in this entire series, also seemed to have no loyalty or convictions, and she only switched to Ethan's side when Jim rejected her, which is exactly what happens with this woman here. Gabriel tosses her to one side based on his suspicion that she's going to betray him, and then of course that's exactly what she does. loyalties. And speaking of suspect loyalties, even though Kettridge does seem like he's done something a little bit naughty, Grace is still very willing to, at the end of it, ask to officially join the IMF. And that's what sets us up for the next film. Unless I have a really bad sense of timing, I think I've definitely spoken about this film for less time than I have for any of the others. And I guess that's because even though this is significantly longer than the standard runtime for these films, it's still part one, and as such, not that much actually happens. And most of what happened was pretty bad. I mean, Grace was supposed to be the highlight of this review because I did find her better than most of the other side characters here. But even then, I had plenty of criticisms, and she still doesn't leave an overall hugely positive impression. The villain's bad, the plot is kind of interesting, the action is pretty entertaining, although there's really not that much more entertaining action considering how much longer this film is. The only big highlight was him riding that motorcycle off the edge of a cliff. That was awesome. But can one awesome moment really make up for a whole movie? I did say we were on a positive trajectory with the last 3 films each getting successively better ratings. So maybe we were on track for this film to be a low 7. Nope. In fact, I'm almost inclined to not just go back to the Ghost Protocol rating of a low 6, but even back to the rating I gave the first film of a high 5. I mean, this has a bad villain like Ghost Protocol, I think probably a worse villain, and it has fewer side characters I liked, fewer standout moments I could compliment. In fact, you know what? This is probably worse than the first one. It's a middling 5. All I did was watch this film and write down my thoughts, and I can't believe how much negative stuff I've had to say, and how little I could actually find to enjoy here. Oh, what a negative note to end on. I mean, this is the end of the video. Oh wait, I probably titled this Ranking the Mission Impossible movies because I think people prefer ranking over rating as a concept. Fortunately, I have given all of these films different ratings. That wasn't on purpose. I genuinely think that none of these films are the exact same in terms of quality. So here's the ranking in case you can't be bothered to work this out yourself. In bottom place is Mission Impossible 2, almost entirely because of all the cheap tricks they kept doing with those stupid masks. Aside from that, I've actually favourably compared this film to the later ones, so if you got rid of those stupid masks, this would rank a lot higher. Next is this film, Dead Reckoning. Then the first film, where of course it was still finding its feet as a franchise. Ghost Protocol just misses out on the podium with the 4th film coming 4th. And in 3rd place we have Rogue Nation, 2nd place is Fallout, and the best Mission Impossible film so far is Mission Impossible 3. It's also the only film that is separated from the others in terms of its rating by a clear margin. But that won't be the case if the next film gets a low 7 and fills in that gap. And that would also place it as the 2nd best film, which would be a pretty high note to end on, so let's all hope for that.